The story of the Gauls begins not with empire or conquest, but with slow-moving transformations lost in the shadows of prehistory, with firelit settlements tucked deep in the wooded valleys of Central Europe, and with a people whose language, customs, and ways of life would one day ripple across half the continent. These early folk, distant ancestors of the Gauls, lived not by written record but by oral memory, by rhythm of season and cycle of stars, by the smell of earth and iron and the dance of smoke rising from hearthstones. By the closing centuries of the second millennium BCE, scattered farming communities, ancestors of what we would one day call the Celts, were already spreading westward out of the Danubian basin. Their world was one of rivers and hills, thick forests, wide skies. They moved in small kin groups, their lives tied tightly to the land, their settlements composed of round houses with woven walls and thatched roofs. Their burial rites, intricate, symbolic, reveal not just grief, but reverence, identity, and belief in continuities beyond death. It was during this long twilight that the Urnfield culture emerged, around 1300 BCE, stretching across Central Europe from the Alps to the Low Countries. Named for the practice of cremating the dead and burying their ashes in ceramic urns placed in clustered fields, this cultural horizon marked a new stage in identity, a recognition that memory could be grounded in soil, that the dead could be gathered together not only in spirit but in place. These fields of urns were sacred maps of kinship, community, and land. But it was not only burial that changed. The people of the Urnfield world forged new relationships, with metal, with terrain, with each other. Bronze tools and weapons became increasingly refined, hilltop fortifications began to appear, long-distance trade, though limited, brought amber from the Baltic and bronze from the south. Their language, already distantly Indo-European, began to fracture and develop, shaped by geography and encounter. Out of these dialects, the Celtic language family would one day emerge. By the dawn of the Iron Age, around 800 BCE, something new was stirring in the valleys of what is now Austria and southern Germany. Archaeologists would later name it the Hallstatt culture, after a lakeside village where rich graves and salt mines preserved an ancient world beneath layers of silt and time. Here, iron tools began to replace bronze, salt became a cornerstone of wealth, and burial mounds rose like quiet sentinels above the hills. Hallstatt was not a kingdom, but a network, a shared material culture linking scattered communities across Central Europe, from Bohemia to Burgundy. Its people were no longer simple farmers. They were warriors, artisans, traders. Burial goods reveal social stratification. Some graves held only modest pottery and simple ornaments, others were packed with weapons, horse trappings, chariots, and gold. The dead spoke, not in words, but in presence, in offering, in what was chosen to accompany them into silence. It is from this soil, these graves, these weapons, and brooches and wheels, that we begin to see the Gauls take form. They were not yet called Gauls. That name would come later, from Roman tongues. But the people who would one day stand on Gallic soil were already finding their shape, in language, in art, in the rhythm of tribal life. They believed, even then, that the world was filled with unseen forces. Sacred groves held spirits. Streams whispered secrets. Thunder was the voice of something greater. The seeds of what we would call druidism were being planted, not as a doctrine, but as a felt truth, carried in stories and rituals and the silence of old trees. The Hallstatt world was both simple and profound. Life was bound to the land, but also stretched outward through trade and travel. Amber from the north, coral from the Mediterranean, Greek pottery and Etruscan goods all found their way into Hallstatt tombs. These were not isolated barbarians, they were connected, listening, absorbing. They stood at the edge of old Europe and knew. And though they would not yet call themselves Gauls, and though they left no written trace of their thoughts, they lived with intensity, with structure, with purpose. Their story was already underway, unfolding not in the noise of conquest but in the quiet strength of earth and fire. It was only the beginning. It was in the heartlands of Central Europe, among the salt-rich valleys of what is now Austria, that the Hallstatt culture reached its zenith between roughly 800 and 500 BCE. This culture did not emerge in isolation, nor did it fall from the sky. It was the culmination of generations of evolution, experimentation, and exchange. It was here that the first true contours of Gallic civilization began to emerge, not yet in name, but unmistakably in spirit. Hallstatt society was stratified and organized. Some families held more land, more cattle, more weapons, more influence. In the mounds they left behind, we see the outlines of hierarchy, in one grave a simple urn, in another a full chariot, iron swords, bronze cauldrons, and goods from distant lands. These burials speak of leadership, of status, and of ritual. The salt mines at Hallstatt, the source of its early prosperity, were more than economic engines. They were natural preservers of history. Deep within the earth, the salt kept intact tools, textiles, and even human remains. From these depths emerged leather shoes, wooden rakes, woolen garments, everyday things, but imbued with extraordinary meaning. They told of a people skilled in craft, careful in labor, and deeply tied to the cycles of work and season. Their settlements were modest by later standards, clusters of timber homes, often built near trade routes or defensible positions. Fireplaces formed the heart of these homes. Around them, stories were told, meals shared, and knowledge passed. The hearth was a place of life and memory, and each home a world unto itself. Trade was vital. Hallstatt elites acquired prestige goods from across the continent. From the south came Etruscan pottery, bronze vessels, and drinking horns. From the north, Baltic amber and furs. These items were not mere luxuries, they were symbols, tokens of power, and likely served roles in ceremony and alliance building. But it was the iron that changed everything. Iron ore was more abundant than the tin and copper needed for bronze. With it, the people of Hallstatt forged stronger tools, better weapons, and new forms of control over land and labor. Iron cleared more forests, plowed deeper furrows, and armed more warriors. It democratized strength, but it also concentrated power in the hands of those who controlled its sources and trade. Weapons found in burials, long, double-edged swords, spears, and shields, suggest not only conflict, but a warrior ethos. Some swords bear intricate hilts shaped like human figures, perhaps symbolic or even magical in purpose. These were not tools of random violence, but of identity. To hold a sword was to be someone. And yet, Hallstatt society was not built only on warfare. There was ritual, craft, and governance. Councils of elders likely ruled by consensus, with chieftains emerging in times of war or ceremony. Law was remembered, not written. Justice was delivered by voice and witness, not scroll. Power was personal, not bureaucratic, grounded in lineage, reputation, and the sacred. Women, too, held status. Some female burials contain fine jewelry, mirrors, and imported goods, signs of wealth, yes, but also of social role. The weaving of cloth, the brewing of mead, the tending of herds, these were not mere domestic tasks but economic and ceremonial ones. Women were not silent figures on the edge of history. They were bearers of tradition, managers of wealth, and, at times, leaders in their own right. Religion, if it can even be separated from life itself, was ever present. While written doctrine did not exist, the rhythms of nature, the signs of the stars, and the patterns in bone and fire guided choices and beliefs. Groves, springs, and hills held sacred power. Animals were sacrificed. The dead were honored with ceremony and grave goods, not to display wealth, but to maintain balance between the worlds. By the end of the Hallstatt period, Celtic-speaking peoples had spread across a vast expanse of Europe. The seeds sown in the salt-rich earth of Hallstatt were bearing fruit across the continent, in the forests of Gaul, the highlands of Bohemia, and the valleys of the Rhine. Tribes moved, mingled, and changed. Out of these movements, new forms would rise. One of them would be the Latine culture, the true flowering of Celtic artistry, identity, and expansion. But the roots lay here, in Hallstatt, in the silence of the mines, the quiet dignity of the dead, and the rising hum of iron upon stone. Around the middle of the 5th century BCE, as the old patterns of the Hallstatt world began to wane, a new cultural force surged across the landscape of Central and Western Europe. It rose beside the waters of Lake Neuchatel in present-day Switzerland, where a lakeside settlement at Latine would lend its name to one of the most striking and influential phases of Celtic history. What began there would stretch from the Atlantic coast to the Carpathian Mountains, leaving behind artistry, architecture, and echoes of movement. The age of the Latine Gauls had begun. This new culture did not emerge from nothing. It was a continuation, a refinement, a reawakening of earlier Hallstatt forms. But it was also a transformation. The Latine world was more fluid, more mobile, more expressive. Where Hallstatt swords had been solemn and solid, Latine weapons curled like vines, with hilts flowing like tendrils and blades as much sculpture as steel. Brooches, fibulae, torcs, and scabbards gleamed with swirling patterns, eyes of animals, and abstract, almost dreamlike motifs. This was not merely decoration, it was worldview made visible. The Latine Gauls moved. They did not remain confined to the Alpine valleys. Their tribes, known from later Roman names like the Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, Helvetii, Volcae, and many more, spread west into Gaul, north into the Belgic lands, east into Bohemia and Pannonia, and south into Italy. This was not migration as desperation, it was assertion. Their settlements followed rivers and ridges. Their markets reached across mountains and seas. They built oppida, large fortified hill towns, with timber ramparts and commanding views. These were not merely strongholds. They were centers of craft, governance, ritual, and trade. Within their walls, blacksmiths forged iron tools and weapons, potters shaped clay, and merchants bartered for wine, salt, furs, and glass. Coins, now minted by the Gauls themselves, bore local symbols, deities, and tribal emblems. These oppida marked a new urbanism, native, proud, and distinct from the stone cities of the Mediterranean. The Latine period was also a time of cultural confidence. The Gauls developed a distinctive visual language, one that favored curves over angles, fluidity over rigidity. It appeared on metalwork, ceramics, wooden carvings, and even stone monuments. Faces were stylized, with almond-shaped eyes and solemn expressions. Animals appeared not as realistic depictions, but as symbols: wolves, boars, horses, serpents, each holding meaning, power, and place. And as the Gauls expanded, they did not remain insular. They encountered the Greeks and the Etruscans, trading goods and ideas. Gallic warriors served as mercenaries in the armies of the Mediterranean. In some places, especially in the south of Gaul, they adopted amphory, wine-drinking customs, and writing systems. But they did not become Greek, they remained Gaulish, adapting without surrender. It is also in this age that the druids emerge more clearly in the historical and archaeological record, not as mystics alone, but as lawmakers, teachers, and keepers of tribal memory. Though Roman accounts would come later, the Druids' power was rooted in this period. They trained for years, spoke in poetic verse, and judged disputes among nobles. They were the custodians of knowledge, astronomical, legal, religious, and they held authority greater than that of kings in some matters. Yet for all their cohesion, the Gauls were not unified. Each tribe was its own world, with its own chieftains, customs, and rivalries. Alliances shifted like wind in the forest. Some tribes cooperated in times of threat, but lasting unity proved elusive. It would become their greatest vulnerability in the century to come. Still, at their height, the Gauls were more than raiders or farmers. They were architects of a rich and dynamic civilization. Their iron tools cut forests into fields. Their roads wound through valleys and into hearts of distant markets. Their art spoke a language that had no need of words. Their warriors rode into battle not as mobs, but as trained fighters, shield in one hand, spear in the other, a torque at the throat, and the cry of their ancestors on the wind. By the 3rd century BCE, the Gauls stood at the height of their power. Their land sprawled across what would become modern France, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of Germany and Italy. They were admired and feared by their neighbors. And soon, they would push further, across the Alps and into history's darker pages. Before the Republic of Rome had yet conquered its own peninsula, it would face a foe unlike any other, a people of iron and wind, fire and freedom, the Gauls. It was in the early decades of the 4th century BCE that the Gauls, emboldened by prosperity, crowded by growth, and drawn by the lure of fertile plains, turned their gaze southward, toward the lands of northern Italy. There, beyond the towering Alps, lay the Po Valley, a rich and temperate region long inhabited by the Etruscans, Umbrians, and other Italic tribes. But to the Gallic eye, it was open, warm, and ripe. The crossing of the Alps was not a single event, but a movement of peoples, wave upon wave of Gallic tribes, among them the Senones, Boii, Cenomani, Linguans, and Insubres. They did not come as a unified army but as migrating nations. Entire communities, men, women, children, flocks, passed through high mountain passes and carved a new home into the northern plains. By around 400 BCE, these newcomers had displaced local populations and founded new strongholds. Some became permanent cities: Mediolanum, modern Milan, Bononia, Bologna, and Mutina, Modena, Gallic in blood, but destined for a Roman future. At first, the Italians saw the Gauls as distant and dangerous, but not yet pressing. The Etruscans had grown used to external threats. Rome was still a city-state among many. But the Gauls were different, fast-moving, unpredictable, and contemptuous of Italian customs. Their speech, dress, and bearing marked them as foreign. Their talks of gold, their painted shields, their cries in battle, all struck unease into Italic hearts. And then came the day that would change Roman memory forever. In 390 BCE, a Gallic tribe known as the Senones, under a chieftain named Brennus, descended toward central Italy. Whether provoked or driven by ambition is debated, but they clashed with Roman forces at the banks of the Allia River, north of the city. The Roman legions, unprepared and overconfident, broke under the charge. It was not a battle. It was a rout. The Gauls marched on Rome. What followed was both shocking and formative. Rome, nearly undefended, was sacked. The capital itself, the spiritual heart of the city, held out for a time, but most of Rome was burned or looted. It was said that the Romans offered a ransom in gold to spare further destruction. When they protested at the weights used to measure it, Brennus cast his sword upon the scale and declared, "Vae victis." Woe to the vanquished! Though the Romans would eventually drive out the Gauls and rebuild, the sack of Rome left a wound that never fully healed. It instilled a deep, generational fear of the northern tribes. From that day onward, the word Gallus in Rome would evoke not just a people, but a spectre of fire, of humiliation, of vengeance deferred. For the Gauls, the victory at Rome was not followed by empire. They returned to their lands, enriched and remembered, but not united. The tribes continued to raid and trade, settle and resettle. In the coming decades, some would push further south, others east into Illyria and the Balkans, others west into Iberia. Their mobility was both strength and weakness. They had no central plan, no king of kings, no vision of dominion. They lived as tribes do in the moment, by the honor of war and the balance of kinship. And yet, the sack of Rome set a precedent. It reminded the ancient world that the Gauls were no mere border people. They could strike at the heart of civilization and emerge alive. In the years that followed, Gallic groups, often invited as mercenaries, other times as invaders, moved deeper into the Mediterranean world. Some crossed the Adriatic into Greece, others pressed into Thrace, even Macedonia. Their presence, often fleeting, always forceful, left impressions on those they met, not just of violence, but of unpredictability, of a people who danced on the edge of chaos. But not all who moved south did so with fire and sword. Some stayed, settled, intermarried. In northern Italy, Gauls became neighbors, traders, farmers. Their villages grew into towns. Their customs softened. And over time, their children grew up speaking a mix of tongues, Gallic and Italic, and living lives increasingly shaped by the rhythms of their new homeland. This duality of violence and settlement, destruction and assimilation, would come to define Gallic interaction with the wider world. They were not simply invaders. They were participants in the shaping of Europe. And as the centuries turned, their boldest venture was yet to come eastward, far beyond the Adriatic, into the ancient heart of Greece itself. By the closing years of the 3rd century BCE, the Gauls had grown restless once more. Their tribes had fanned across much of Western and Central Europe, yet the pull of the south, of wealth, legend, and conquest, stirred again in their blood. Their scouts spoke of a land beyond the mountains, where cities glittered and temples stood like palaces. That land was Greece, the cradle of philosophy and theatre, but to the Gauls, it was something else, a challenge. In 280 BCE, a vast coalition of Gallic tribes, some from the Danube basin, others from the Alpine borderlands, gathered under a warrior chief who bore the same name as the one who had burned Rome a century earlier, Brennus. Whether it was the same man in spirit or merely a mantle passed down is unknown, but this Brennus carried the same flame, bold, unyielding, and ravenous. The Gauls first descended into Macedonia, overwhelming its defences and defeating the army of Ptolemy Koronos, who was slain in battle. The Macedonian throne, long a symbol of strength since the days of Alexander, now lay shattered beneath Gallic feet. From there, the war bands pushed south, looting and laying waste. The Greeks, long divided among their city-states, could not muster a unified defense. Panic spread. Temples were emptied. People fled into the mountains. But Brennus had his eyes on a greater prize. High in the mountains of Phocis, nestled among jagged ridges and sacred stones, lay the sanctuary of Delphi, home to Apollo's oracle, the spiritual heart of the Greek world. To the Greeks, Delphi was not merely a temple, it was the navel of the earth, the point where heaven and man touched. To the Gauls, it was treasure. The march to Delphi was grueling. The Greek defenders, bolstered by volunteers and hardened by desperation, fought fiercely. As the Gauls climbed into the passes, the weather turned. Ancient writers tell of unnatural storms, of icy rains and thunderbolts, of divine anger. Whether by natural misfortune or fierce resistance, the Gauls were driven back. Brennus, wounded and defeated, either died from his injuries or took his own life. His men, leaderless and starving, scattered. Some were slain by local forces. Others fled north, only to be hunted down. The dream of plundering Delphi had ended in ruin. But not all was lost for the Gauls. A segment of the retreating warbands turned east, crossing into Asia Minor with permission from local Hellenistic rulers eager for strong arms in their power struggles. These Gallic settlers carved out a new homeland in the highlands of central Anatolia. There, they founded Galatia, a name the region would bear for centuries. The Galatians did not merely survive, they flourished. They adapted to the terrain, intermarried, and built fortified hilltop towns. Though surrounded by Greeks and later Romans, they retained their language, their tribal divisions, and their distinct warrior culture. For generations, Galatian mercenaries served in Eastern armies, sometimes feared, sometimes admired, always remembered. In time, even the Christian world would take note of them. In the New Testament, Paul the Apostle would write a letter, the Epistle to the Galatians, addressing early converts in this very land. Though their swords had long since dulled, their name echoed through scripture and sermon. Back in Europe, the failed campaign in Greece did not erase Gallic pride. Instead, it added to the mystique of a people who had dared to march on the holiest shrines of the ancient world. To the Greeks, the Gauls were barbarians, wild, brutal, unchecked. But to themselves, they were survivors, wanderers, and warriors who tested the boundaries of the known world. And though Delphi was beyond their grasp, the fire that had driven them there had not gone out. Back in their western homelands, in the land the Romans would call Gallia, new generations were rising, proud, fierce, and deeply rooted in the soil of oak groves, iron fields, and storm-lit skies. Their greatest test was still to come, and with it, their greatest legacy. By the 3rd century BCE, the land that would become known as Gallia, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Alps, from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, was not a unified nation, but a tapestry of tribes, each distinct yet bound by shared language, custom, and blood. These were not minor clans or scattered villages, they were complex societies, with their own laws, councils, priests, and warriors. Their world pulsed with rivalry, tradition, and fierce attachment to place. To the Romans, these people were all Galli. But to themselves, they were Aedui, Arverni, Carnutes, Bituriges, Senones, Sequani, Helvetii, Belgae, and dozens more. Each name carried centuries of memory, of ancestors, migrations, battles won and lost, of sacred groves and tribal boundaries traced by river and stone. The Arverni, centered in the rich volcanic lands of the Massif Central, were among the most powerful. They controlled wide territories, collected tribute, and produced leaders like Luernius, who, as ancient writers tell, once distributed silver from his chariot to demonstrate his wealth. His descendants would include Vercingetorix, the great unifier in the final struggle against Rome. North of them, the Aedui were both rivals and occasional allies. Their capital at Bibracte, perched atop Mont Beuvray, was a thriving oppidum, fortified, urban, and politically influential. They would later become friends of Rome, a status that brought both privilege and danger. The Carnutes, in the heart of Gaul, held a sacred role. Their forests were said to be the gathering place of the druids, who met in secret groves once a year to decide matters of law and faith. Among them, the spiritual rhythms of Gallic life were at their strongest. To the east, along the upper Rhone and the Jura, lived the Sequani and the Helvetii, controlling key alpine passes and trade routes. And in the far north, closer to the lowlands and the Germanic frontier, were the Belgae, a confederation of warlike tribes that the Romans claimed were the bravest of all the Gauls, hardened by constant conflict with neighboring peoples. Each of these tribes maintained their own governance. Some were ruled by kings, others by assemblies of nobles. Justice was dispensed by custom and enforced by honor. Alliances were common, but fragile. Feuds could last generations. Yet there was also shared identity, visible in dress, language, weapons, and religious rites. Their settlements, known as oppida, were often built on heights, surrounded by timber and earth ramparts. Within these hillforts were neighborhoods, workshops, marketplaces, and shrines. Streets were planned, water managed, and defense carefully considered. This was not chaos, but civilization, native and independent. Their economy was both local and connected. Farmers raised grain, cattle, pigs, and sheep. Artisans worked in iron, bronze, glass, and gold. Trade reached far beyond Gaul, amphorae of Roman wine, Etruscan pottery, Greek oil, and even Baltic amber passed through Gallic hands. Their coinage, often bearing horses, sun symbols, or stylized heads, revealed both prosperity and symbolic vision. The warrior class was central to society. Nobles maintained retinues of armed followers. Loyalty was rewarded with feasting, gifts, and plunder. Battles were fought with long iron swords, oval shields, and spears. Some warriors fought bare-chested or even nude, believing it showed their courage and disdain for death. And then there were the druids. Though not organized as a single church or temple hierarchy, the druids held immense power. They were not just priests, but judges, teachers, astronomers, and keepers of memory. They taught by oral tradition, training for years in secret. Their role in tribal society was as essential as that of any king. They officiated sacrifices, interpreted omens, resolved disputes, and taught the myths and laws of the people. Women, too, played important roles as landowners, seers, and matriarchs. While their status varied by tribe, women could inherit, lead households, and in some cases even command in times of crisis. The world of the Gauls was richly layered, not a uniform culture, but a living mosaic. Each tribe was a reflection of its landscape. The stony highlands of the Arverni bred endurance, the river-crossed plains of the Aedui nourished diplomacy, the forested lands of the Carnutes inspired spiritual depth. But for all their strength, the Gauls lacked one thing: unity. They had no central council, no shared capital, no enduring federation. Their independence, their pride, the very soul of their strength, would prove the chink in their armor. And beyond the Alps, a power was watching, waiting, and sharpening its sword. The Republic of Rome had not forgotten the sack of its city. Nor would it forgive. By the 3rd century BCE, a quiet tension had begun to build across the Alps. Though Rome and the Gallic tribes of northern Italy had clashed before, most notably at the Allia and in the sack of Rome, these encounters had been episodic. The Gauls raided, Rome retaliated, and the years passed. Yet the shadow of that early humiliation lingered in Roman memory, a wound not yet healed. And as Rome grew stronger, more organized, and more ambitious, the frontier between these two worlds began to shift. In the rich lands of Cisalpine Gaul, the region between the Alps and the Apennines, Gallic tribes like the Boii, Insubres, and Senones had long established themselves. They had built towns, cultivated fields, and traded with Italic peoples. But Rome's rising influence in Etruria and the Adriatic coast began to encroach upon these tribal territories. Roads, colonies, and treaties with local allies signaled that the Romans were not content with the boundaries of old. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BCE, fought far to the south in Sicily, distracted Rome for a time. But once Carthage was pushed back, Roman eyes turned north again. The Gauls, watching this expansion, saw the pattern clearly. Their autonomy was under threat. In 225 BCE, alarmed by Rome's growing presence, a coalition of Gallic tribes, including the Boii, Insubres, and Taurini, rallied for one last great push. They gathered tens of thousands of warriors and swept south into Etruria, reaching as far as Clusium. But the Roman response was swift and brutal. At the Battle of Telamon, the Roman legions, commanded by consuls Gaius Atilius Regulus and Lucius Aemilius Pappus, caught the Gauls between two armies. It was a massacre. The Gallic army, trapped and outmaneuvered, was destroyed. Tens of thousands were slain or captured. Their leaders were killed in battle. It marked the end of Gallic dominance in Cisalpine Italy. In the years that followed, Rome launched a systematic campaign of conquest. Cities were sacked, lands seized, and colonies planted. Placentia and Cremona, Roman outposts, became footholds in a conquered land. And yet, even as Roman boots marched north, a new storm gathered to the west, one that would involve both Rome and the Gauls in a drama that would shake the ancient world. His name was Hannibal. The Carthaginian general, planning a surprise attack on Rome, sought allies beyond the Alps. He crossed the mountains in 218 BC with elephants, cavalry, and an army forged for vengeance. As he descended into Cisalpine Gaul, he found not enemies, but partners. The Insubres and Boii, still smarting from Roman conquest, welcomed him. They provided scouts, guides, and warriors. In the Battle of the Trebia, and later at Lake Trasimene, Gallic troops fought alongside Carthaginians, helping to deliver Rome some of its most stinging defeats. For a time, it seemed the alliance might change the fate of Italy. But Hannibal's campaign, though bold, could not break Rome's will. Over the long war, the Gauls suffered enormous losses. Their villages were burned by Roman reprisals. Their sons died in foreign campaigns. And as Carthage's power waned, the Gallic tribes were left once more to face Rome alone. By 191 BCE, Rome had established full control over Cisalpine Gaul. The Via Aemilia, built in 187 BCE, cut across the region, linking Ariminum to Placentia. Roman colonies dotted the plains. Latin became the language of law and commerce. Some Gallic tribes adapted, others resisted. But resistance was increasingly futile. Yet across the Alps, in Transalpine Gaul, the story was different. Here, among the wild rivers, thick forests, and windswept hills, the Gallic tribes still lived free. They traded with Massilia, the Greek city on the coast, modern Marseille, and watched Rome from a distance. Their world was not yet conquered, but it was no longer invisible. Rome's conquest of Cisalpine Gaul was a warning. The Republic was not merely a southern power. It was an empire in the making. And in the coming century, its legions would march again, not just into Italy, but deep into the heart of Gaul itself. While the Gauls of the Italian plains grappled with the hard edge of Roman conquest, their cousins across the Alps, in the lands of southern Gaul, still lived beyond the reach of the eagle. But change was coming. Rome, victorious over Carthage and flush with ambition, now turned its gaze westward, toward the Mediterranean shore where the lands of Gallia Transalpina kissed the sea. Here, the world was different. The Mediterranean climate brought olives, grapes, and grain in abundance. Greek merchants from Massilia had long since founded coastal trading posts, and inland, Gallic tribes such as the Volcae, Saluvii, and Allobriges watched with a wary eye. They were no strangers to outsiders. Trade passed through their lands. So did skirmishes. But now, a new kind of presence appeared, organized, permanent, and patient. The story began, as it often did, with an alliance. Massilia, wealthy, Greek, and vulnerable, had been harassed by neighboring Gallic tribes for years. In the mid-2nd century BCE, fearing that their influence might crumble under constant pressure, they turned to Rome for aid. The Romans, always eager for a pretext to extend their frontier, agreed. In 125 BCE, Roman legions crossed into southern Gaul. They fought the Saluvii, whose warriors, fierce but scattered, were overwhelmed. Their oppidum near modern Aix-en-Provence fell. A Roman colony, Aquae Sextii, was soon founded on the same site, a clear signal that Rome had come not merely to protect, but to stay. The campaign continued. In 121 BCE, the legions confronted the Arverni and Allobriges, whose territory stretched deep into the Rhone valley. The decisive clash came near Vindalium and then at the confluence of the Rhone and Isere rivers, where Roman forces, led by Quintus Fabius Maximus, defeated a coalition of Gallic warriors. Thousands were slain. Even the mighty Torcs, king of the Arverni, was taken prisoner. The result was transformative. Rome annexed a wide swath of territory, establishing a province, the first in Gaul, known as the Provincia Romana, or simply Provincia. In time, it would give its name to the entire region, Provence. The region's transformation began swiftly. Roman engineers laid roads, including the Via Domitia, linking Italy to Spain through southern Gaul. New settlements were founded, among them Nemausus, Nims, Arlate, Arles, and Narbo Martius, Narbonne, the last becoming the provincial capital. These were not just military outposts, they were cities of stone, arches, forums, and aqueducts. Latin began to replace Gaulish in administration and commerce. Temples rose beside old shrines. Roman law took root, and local chieftains who cooperated were rewarded with Roman titles and wealth. The old order did not vanish overnight, but it began to bend. And yet, the Provincia was not only a conquest, it was a threshold. To the north and west, beyond the reach of the Roman census, the tribes of Greater Gaul still lived free. The Aedui, Arverni, Sequani, Bituriges, Carnutes, and dozens more kept their own laws, spoke their own tongue, and gathered in the sacred groves of their ancestors. They watched the slow Roman crawl with suspicion and pride. But even they could not ignore the changes rippling from the south. Roman wine flowed up the valleys of the Rhone. Roman merchants came bearing goods, coins, and ideas. Roman allies, like the Aedui, received aid, while others, like the Sequani, sought help from rival Germanic tribes. The fragile balance that had held Gaul together for centuries began to fray. It was in this world, a land at once proud and divided, rich and vulnerable, that Rome's most audacious commander would one day march. A man whose name would forever bind Rome and Gaul in the fire of war. Gaius Julius Caesar. But that chapter had not yet begun. For now, the provincia stood like a bridgehead, a Roman gate upon Gallic soil, a foretaste of empire. In the decades before Caesar's arrival, Gaul stood at a crossroads, a land of proud traditions and mounting tensions, where the old rhythms of tribal life began to clash with the currents of external pressure. Though still independent from direct Roman rule, the Gallic tribes found themselves drawn into a tightening net of politics, trade, and war. Rome was no longer a distant power, it was now a presence at the border, and its shadow fell long across the land. Yet Gaul was not one land. It was many. To the north, the Belgae, a fierce and independent confederation of tribes, guarded the edge of the known world, where the forests thickened and the sky grew low. Tribes like the Nervii, Atuatuci, and Eburones lived here, hardened by border warfare and proud of their autonomy. Roman writers would later call them the most warlike of all the Gauls. Central Gaul, by contrast, was the domain of the Aedui, Arverni, Carnutes, and Bituriges, peoples with larger oppida, organized noble classes, and growing links to Roman trade. The Aedui, in particular, had entered into alliance with Rome, receiving the honored title of Brothers of the Roman people. They sought to leverage Roman friendship to secure advantage over rivals. But such alliances were double-edged. To the east, along the Rhine, other tribes like the Sequani and Helvetii stood close to Germanic lands. The Sequani, embittered by Aeduan influence, invited German warlords, most notably Ariovistus, a powerful Suebi chief, to cross the Rhine and help in their wars. But they underestimated the guest they had welcomed. The Germans came not as allies, but as conquerors, taking land, demanding tribute, and upsetting the fragile balance of Gallic politics. In the south, near the Roman province, Gallic society was changing most rapidly. Latin words crept into daily speech. Local chieftains built stone houses. Roman wine, once a luxury, became common. Yet even here, identity remained strong. The Gauls had not forgotten who they were. What held them together was not law, nor central authority, but a shared culture, language, ritual, belief, and memory. The druids continued to teach, to judge, and to bind the tribes through custom and sacred ceremony. They passed their knowledge orally, refusing to write it down, preserving it in hearts and songs rather than scrolls. The groves of the Carnutes, deep in the central forests, remained a spiritual heart, where druids from across Gaul gathered to decide great matters. But Gaul was also increasingly strained. Population growth, shifting climate patterns, and land hunger pushed tribes against each other. Minor disputes flared into open war. Prestige and honor were everything. To gain them, nobles fought, allied, betrayed, and feasted. The warrior elite, ever restless, rallied around charismatic leaders who could promise spoils and glory. And in such a world, charisma could rise quickly. Among the Arverni, there were whispers of a new generation of leaders, ones who might unite, rather than divide. Among the Helvetii, there were plans for migration, to abandon their overpopulated valleys and seek new land to the west. Among the Aedui, there were deep fears of Germanic domination. The Gauls, long proud and self-governed, were now looking outward, for help, for advantage, for survival. It was in this moment of tension, with Gaul both rich and divided, confident yet anxious, that Julius Caesar was assigned to govern the Roman province. His official role was limited: consul, governor of Transalpine Gaul. But Caesar did not see limits, he saw opportunity. He watched, listened, and waited. He saw the Helvetii begin to march. He saw the tribes splinter into factions. He understood that the Gauls were brave and numerous, but they were not one. And so, in the year 58 BCE, Caesar made his move. He summoned his legions. He crossed the boundary of duty. And with calculated boldness, he stepped into the heart of Gaul. The Gallic Wars had begun. In the spring of 58 BCE, a great migration stirred the lands beyond the Jura Mountains. The Helvetii, a proud and populous Gallic tribe inhabiting what is now modern Switzerland, had grown restless. Pressed by Germanic incursions to the east, constrained by mountainous terrain, and inspired by tales of richer lands in western Gaul, they made a bold and fateful decision to abandon their homeland. They would not go alone. Joined by allied tribes, the Tulingi, later Brigi, and Raurici, the Helvetii planned to lead their entire population westward. Roughly 368,000 people, including women, children, and elders, gathered their possessions, set fire to their villages and granaries, and formed a vast moving column. Behind them, nothing but smoke and ruin. Ahead, the uncertain promise of fertile land near the Atlantic. Their path, however, ran through Roman territory. To reach their goal, the Helvetii needed to pass through the province of Narbonensis, crossing the Rhone River at Geneva, modern Geneva. It was here that they encountered the new Roman governor, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar, though only recently arrived, recognized the situation for what it was, both a threat and an opportunity. Allowing hundreds of thousands of armed Gauls to cross the Roman province unchallenged would invite disaster. But defeating them, and defending Rome's frontier, would grant him glory, authority, and the loyalty of his legions. He refused their request. The Helvetii, undeterred, sought another route, north of the Jura, through the lands of the Sequani and the Aedui. The Sequani agreed. The Aedui, though nominally Roman allies, were too weak to resist. Thus the migration continued, a slow and perilous journey marked by conflict, foraging, and growing tension. Along the way, they pillaged Aeduan lands, prompting urgent appeals for Roman intervention. Caesar responded. He swiftly led his legions north, crossing the Saone River with impressive speed. His forces caught the Helvetii mid-crossing and attacked a portion of their column. Many perished, the rest fled. It was not yet a decisive victory, but Caesar had made his mark. The Roman army, disciplined, ruthless, had blooded the Helvetii. Still, the migration continued westward. Weeks later, the two sides met again in a full-scale confrontation at the Battle of Bibracte. Caesar, with 6 legions and allied cavalry, engaged the Helvetii in open combat near the Aeduan capital. The battle was fierce, lasting for hours, with shifting momentum. The Helvetii fought with desperation. For them, defeat meant annihilation. But Roman discipline prevailed. By nightfall, the Gallic column was shattered. Thousands were slain. Others fled into the woods, only to be captured or starved into submission. Caesar offered the survivors a harsh mercy: they would be forced to return to their burnt-out homeland and rebuild. The land would serve as a buffer against German incursions. Their ambition had ended in ruin. This victory, Caesar's first in Gaul, cemented his authority and thrilled Rome. He portrayed the campaign as a defense of Roman allies and civilization against chaos. But it was also the opening move in a much larger game. Caesar had tasted Gallic blood, measured Gallic strength, and seen the fault lines within tribal politics. He knew that Gaul was not yet conquered, only stirred. In the aftermath, emissaries from various tribes came to him. Some sought friendship, others offered warnings. The Aedui spoke of Ariovistus, the Germanic king who now ruled much of eastern Gaul, and whose presence posed an even greater danger than the Helvetii had. The Sequani, once eager for German aid, now trembled under Ariovistus's rule. Caesar saw his next step clearly. The Helvetii had been defeated. Now, the time had come to drive the Germans back across the Rhine, and in doing so, deepen Roman power in Gaul. As the dust of the Helvetian campaign settled, new voices rose among the Gallic tribes, not in joy, but in fear. They spoke not of Roman cruelty, but of another, more immediate menace: Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine years earlier and now ruled a swath of eastern Gaul as a tyrant. Originally invited by the Sequani as an ally against their rivals, the Aedui, Ariovistus had come at the head of thousands of warriors. But like so many before him, he came not only to aid, he came to conquer. His presence had grown like a shadow. He demanded tribute, seized land, and settled German families in Gallic territory. The Sequani now regretted their alliance, and the Aedui, though nominally friends of Rome, had been humiliated, forced to surrender hostages and wealth. To Caesar, this situation was intolerable. The presence of Ariovistus threatened more than Gallic freedom, it threatened Roman prestige. A foreign king ruling in lands Rome now considered its sphere of influence was an affront. It also offered Caesar another justification for war. Defending Roman allies, expelling invaders, these were causes Rome would celebrate. So in late 58 BCE, Caesar summoned Ariovistus to a diplomatic meeting. The German king refused, arrogantly, perhaps, or wary of ambush. When he finally agreed, the encounter was tense. Both men were powerful, proud, and unyielding. Ariovistus argued that he had come at Gallic invitation. He had been declared friend of the Roman people by the Senate itself. He accused Caesar of violating agreements and warned him not to meddle in his affairs. Caesar countered with threats, invoking Rome's duty to protect its allies and warning that further aggression would mean war. The meeting ended in deadlock. Soon after, hostilities erupted. Caesar, moving swiftly, marched his legions into the lands near the Vosges Mountains, where Ariovistus had encamped. The Germanic forces were massive, including not just warriors, but entire tribal groups, women, children, herds. They had come not to raid but to settle. But they had underestimated the Romans. At the Battle of Vosges, the two armies met in fierce combat. The Germans formed their traditional wedge formations, bristling with spears and long hair fluttering in the wind. They sang and chanted, pounding shields and weapons. The Romans answered with tight ranks, discipline, and tactical precision. The battle raged across fields and marshes. For a time, the Germanic flanks pushed the Roman line. But Caesar's cavalry, joined by Gallic allies, struck the enemy from behind. Panic spread. Ariovistus, wounded, fled with a small band across the Rhine. Many of his warriors were cut down in the rout. Others drowned, trying to escape. The German threat was ended, at least for a time. The victory was more than a military triumph. It sent a message to Gaul: Rome was not just a protector, but a power to be reckoned with. The Aedui regained some prestige. The Sequani, humiliated, were left weakened and resentful. The balance of Gallic politics shifted, not toward unity, but further into fragmentation. Caesar, for his part, emerged stronger than ever. He had secured the province, defeated migrating tribes, and expelled a foreign king, all in the span of a single year. His legions now respected him. His enemies feared him. And the Roman Senate, though uneasy at his growing power, could not deny his success. But the deeper Caesar pushed into Gaul, the more he saw a land not yet tamed, a people not yet subdued, a destiny not yet fulfilled. Gaul, with its vast forests, tribal rivalries, and deep spiritual roots, was not conquered in a season. The battles of 58 BCE were only the beginning. In the spring of 57 BCE, Caesar turned his eyes northward, to the rugged lands of the Belgae, the most distant and, by Roman accounts, the most warlike of all the Gallic tribes. Their homeland stretched across the lowlands of what is now Belgium and northern France, a land of thick forests, wide rivers, and stormy skies. The Belgae were many, a confederation of tribes including the Nervii, Atuatuci, Eburones, Viromandui, Remi, and others. Unlike the more Romanized tribes of central Gaul, the Belgae maintained old ways. They had less trade with Rome, fewer Roman allies, and more frequent skirmishes with Germanic peoples across the Rhine. They were hardy, suspicious, and fiercely proud. Rome's growing presence in southern Gaul had stirred them. News of Caesar's campaigns, of the Helvetii's defeat and Ariovistus's fall, spread quickly. The Belgae saw the pattern: Rome did not stop at the borders. And so, in an act of preemptive defiance, they began to arm, to form alliances, and to prepare for war. Caesar moved quickly. With speed that stunned the tribes, he marched north with his legions. Along the way, he encountered the Remi, a Belgic tribe willing to side with Rome. Their envoys brought intelligence, detailing the movements of enemy forces, naming allied and hostile tribes. They warned that the Nervii, in particular, were preparing for a desperate, last-stand battle. Caesar divided his forces. He sent detachments to strike individual tribes, disrupting their cohesion before a full coalition could form. One by one, tribes were forced to surrender or were defeated. The Suessianese capitulated. The Bellovaci were cowed. Yet resistance stiffened as Caesar advanced deeper into Belgic territory. It was in this harsh, forested land that he faced one of his most brutal challenges, the Nervii. The Nervii had no interest in negotiation. They shunned wealth, used no wine, and allowed little foreign trade, believing it weakened character. They gathered warriors from neighboring tribes, including the Atrebates and Viromandui, and lay in wait along the Sabais River, likely the modern Sel. As Caesar's legions began to encamp on the far bank, the Nervii struck. In a sudden, ferocious ambush, tens of thousands of warriors surged from the woods, descending upon the Roman columns as they built their fortifications. It was chaos. The Roman lines buckled. Some units were caught before they could draw weapons. Caesar himself rode into the fray, rallying his troops, giving orders by voice and hand. The Nervii fought with terrifying resolve, not for land or loot, but for survival. Yet Roman discipline, even in crisis, endured. Gradually, the legions regrouped. Units reformed, auxiliaries arrived, and the tide turned. The Nervii, encircled and bloodied, refused to flee. They fought to the last. When the battle ended, Caesar wrote that of the 60,000 warriors who entered battle, barely 500 survived. Whether that figure was exact or exaggerated, the devastation was real. The Nervii were broken, but not forgotten. Their courage earned them even Roman respect. The campaign concluded with the siege of the Aetuatuci, a fortress tribe descended from the Cimbri and Teutons. After negotiations and a deceptive surrender of weapons, they attempted a night breakout, only to be defeated and enslaved. Caesar, angered by their treachery, showed no mercy. By the end of 57 BCE, the Belgae were subdued. Their lands were divided, their leaders slain or submitted, and Roman garrisons established. But Gaul was far from pacified. The tribes had learned that Caesar was relentless. Yet they had also learned that his strength relied on speed, separation, and surprise. If they could unite, if they could coordinate, perhaps they could stand. That hope, that dream of a united Gallic resistance, had not yet found a voice. But it would. As Caesar consolidated his victories in the north, unrest smoldered anew, this time in the west, along the Atlantic coast, where the winds of the sea carried whispers of rebellion. The tribes of Armorica, a rugged region corresponding to modern-day Brittany, had long been different from their eastern cousins. Here lived the Veneti, Osismii, Reduns, and others, seafarers, traders, and coastal warriors who had more in common with the Britons across the Channel than with the landlocked Gauls. The Veneti were the most powerful among them. Skilled sailors, they controlled maritime trade along the Atlantic coast. Their tall, sturdy ships, built of oak, with high prows and sails of leather, ruled the coastal waters, ferrying goods and messages up and down the shoreline and to Britain. Their knowledge of tides, shoals, and winds made them masters of the sea, and thus difficult to subdue. In 56 BCE, as Caesar turned his attention elsewhere, a chain of events ignited rebellion. Roman emissaries, sent to demand grain and hostages, were seized by the Veneti and held captive. The message was clear: the tribes of Armorica would no longer be passive. They had tasted Roman arrogance, and they would endure no more. Caesar, though campaigning in central Gaul, recognized the threat. These were not distant outlaws, they were a vital link in trade and communication. If left unchecked, the Veneti could open Gaul to British support and disrupt Roman supply lines. But there was a problem: this was a war of ships, and Rome was a land power. Undeterred, Caesar ordered the construction of a fleet. His men, drawn from the province and aided by allies, built galleys suited for coastal warfare. Though inferior in size and sturdiness to the Veneti ships, Roman vessels had one advantage: they were more maneuverable. And Caesar had another tool: innovation. The Romans devised hooks and poles to seize enemy rigging, to tear sails from masts and render the great Gallic ships immobile. It was a strategy born not of tradition, but necessity. The decisive battle came off the coast of Morbihan Bay. The Roman fleet, under Decimus Brutus, engaged the Veneti in full. At first, the Gallic ships held advantage, towering over the Roman decks, their thick hulls repelling missiles. But as the battle wore on, the Roman tactics began to bite. Sails were torn, ships crippled. One by one, the great Venetic vessels fell still, helpless against the Roman assault. Eventually, surrounded and outnumbered, the Veneti surrendered. Caesar's response was merciless. Claiming treachery, the seizure of Roman envoys, as justification, he ordered the execution of all tribal leaders and the enslavement of the population. It was not just punishment. It was a warning that defiance, especially in betrayal of parley, would bring utter ruin. With the Veneti crushed, the Roman grip on western Gaul tightened. But something else had begun to stir beneath the surface. The Gauls, though divided in tongue and tribe, were beginning to understand the cost of disunity. One by one, they had fallen. The Helvetia, the Belgae, now the Veneti. Each had fought alone. Each had been overcome. But what if they fought together? Whispers spread through the groves and marketplaces, from the Armorican hills to the Arvernian valleys. A thought once impossible now seemed urgent: a united Gallic resistance. The seeds had been sown. All they needed now was a voice, a leader. And he was coming. In the winter of 54 BCE, after another year of campaigns and uneasy truces, Caesar believed Gaul to be pacified, or at least subdued. He had crushed the Veneti, brought the northern and western tribes to heel, and even crossed the Channel to strike at Britain, hoping to silence any foreign support for Gallic rebels. With the campaigning season ending, Caesar returned to Cisalpine Gaul, leaving his legion scattered across tribal lands in winter quarters. But peace was an illusion. Among the Eburones, a tribe nestled between the Meuse and the Rhine, a leader named Ambiorix began to act. He was no ordinary chieftain. Charismatic, clever, and fluent in Roman customs, he had once played the role of ally, even receiving Caesar's favor. But now, faced with Roman demands for grain, interference in tribal matters, and the growing weight of occupation, Ambiorix made his decision. He would strike first. Joined by his co-ruler Cativolcus, Ambiorix launched a sudden and devastating ambush on a Roman legion encamped near Atuatuca, commanded by Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta. Feigning diplomacy, Ambiorix approached under the guise of friendship, warning the Romans of an impending German attack and offering safe passage. The Roman commanders, divided in opinion, unsure, and isolated, ultimately accepted. It was a trap. As the Romans marched out of their camp, loaded with baggage and confidence, the Eburones fell upon them. The entire legion was annihilated. Sabinus was slain. Cotta fell fighting. Roman standards were lost, a humiliation that echoed across Gaul. It was more than a military disaster. It was inspiration. News of the victory spread like fire. The Gauls, long hesitant, now saw that Rome could be beaten. Other tribes, including the Nervii, Atuatuci, and Menapii, rose in rebellion. Ambiorix urged all Gauls to seize the moment, to drive the Romans from their lands before they could regroup. The dream of coordinated revolt, long dormant, had found a voice. Caesar, wintering in northern Italy, received the news with rage and urgency. He raced back into Gaul, riding day and night, gathering scattered units and rallying loyal allies. He knew the danger. If more legions were caught alone, the rebellion could spread beyond control. He moved fast. The remaining Roman camps were reinforced. Roads were cleared. Supplies secured. In a bold and brutal march, Caesar struck at the Nervii and other rebellious tribes, defeating them before they could unite fully. But Ambiorix eluded him, vanishing into the forests and marshes of his homeland, striking and disappearing like mist. The campaign against Ambiorix would drag on, becoming less a war than a hunt. The Eburones, fighting as guerrillas, avoided pitched battles. They burned their own settlements, poisoned wells, and denied Caesar any clear victory. Even as Roman legions scorched the countryside, the elusive leader remained beyond reach. Ambiorix, in many ways, embodied the Gaul that Rome could never fully conquer, wild, cunning, rooted in the land, and fueled by a vision of freedom. Though ultimately his rebellion failed to expel the Romans, its effects were profound. Caesar's fury grew. His legions became more ruthless. But across Gaul, resistance rekindled. The memory of Ambiorix's ambush, and the Roman fear it sowed, would linger. More tribes now asked the question aloud: if one small tribe could bring an army to ruin, what might all Gaul achieve, if led by one hand? That hand was soon to rise, not from the forests of the north, but from the mountains of the Arverni, where a young noble prepared to change the course of history. His name, Vercingetorix. In the heart of central Gaul, among the ancient volcanic ridges of the Massif Central, lay the land of the Arverni. It was a region steeped in tradition, wild, fertile, and proud, ruled by noble families who traced their lineage through centuries of strength and sovereignty. Among them, in the city of Gigovia, was born a young warrior who would one day rise above all others, Vercingetorix. His name, even then, carried weight. In the Gaulish tongue, it meant Great King of Warriors, a title not merely given, but earned through deed and devotion. He was the son of Celtillus, once a powerful noble who had dared to grasp at kingship. For that ambition, his own people had cast him down, executed, perhaps, or exiled. The lesson was clear: Gaul did not tolerate tyranny. Leadership, among the Arverni as elsewhere, had to be won not only with bloodline, but with merit. Young Vercingetorix grew in this atmosphere of tension, heir to ambition, but surrounded by cautious elders who feared the very notion of kingship. He trained in the ways of the warrior, swordplay, horsemanship, hunting. He learned the arts of persuasion, diplomacy, and ritual. And above all, he listened to druids, to veterans, to the whispers of a land that stirred with unrest. By the early 50s BCE, Gaul was ripe for revolt. The Roman yoke, once accepted by many as a safeguard or convenience, had grown unbearable. Tribute was demanded, hostages taken, laws imposed, and pride trampled. Roman merchants controlled trade. Roman governors meddled in tribal affairs. Roman soldiers garrisoned ancient Oppida. Every tribe had a grievance. Every noble had lost something. And yet, no one dared rise, not yet. In 52 BCE, that silence was shattered. Caesar, now deeply entangled in Roman civil politics, had left Gaul vulnerable. His enemies in Rome sought to strip him of power. His attention was divided. Seeing this, Vercingetorix made his move. He returned to Gergovia, the capital of his people, and called for resistance. The elders rejected him, cautious, remembering the fate of his father. But Vercingetorix did not relent. He left the city, rallied warriors in the countryside, and soon returned with an army at his back. Gergovia opened its gates. From that moment, his star rose swiftly. He sent envoys to neighboring tribes, calling for unity. The language of his message was simple, but potent: freedom, pride, and vengeance. No more submission. No more Roman chains. He called upon sacred rites, ancestral bonds, and the authority of the gods. And Gaul answered. Tribe after tribe pledged their loyalty: the Bituriges, the Carnutes, the Senones, the Parisii, the Cadurci, and many more. Even tribes long divided by feud or rivalry now gathered beneath a single banner. For the first time in memory, Gaul was uniting. Vercingetorix proved not only a charismatic leader, but a strategic genius. He understood the strengths and weaknesses of Gallic warfare. He knew that the Roman legions could not be beaten in open battle, not yet. Instead, he adopted a strategy of scorched earth. Towns were burned, crops destroyed, roads blocked. Roman supply lines would wither. Their legions would starve. His orders were harsh, even brutal. Some tribes hesitated. Some balked at destroying their own homes. But Vercingetorix stood firm. He was not fighting for land. He was fighting for independence. And Gaul, to be free, must suffer. In the spring of that year, the Carnute sparked the wider flame, storming the town of Genabum and slaughtering Roman citizens and merchants. It was a signal fire across the land. War had begun. Caesar, returning from Italy, now faced a different Gaul. This was no scattered rebellion. This was a nation rising. And at its heart rode a man, tall, proud, crowned not by gold, but by the loyalty of warriors who believed at last in something greater than tribe. Vercingetorix, the first true general of a united Gaul, was ready to meet Rome. The year 52 BCE began with a blaze, and Vercingetorix fanned it into a storm. From the citadel of Gergovia, he launched a campaign that would sweep across the heart of Gaul. This was no raid, no scattered uprising, it was organized resistance. And unlike past revolts, it followed a clear design. He would deny the Romans resources, avoid pitched battles unless conditions favored him, and force Caesar to stretch his armies thin across hostile, barren lands. The plan was bold. The execution, remarkable. Tribes across Gaul answered Vercingetorix's call. Garrisons were ambushed. Roman supply trains were intercepted. Roads were sabotaged. Villages loyal to Rome were punished. Towns deemed indefensible were burned, their grain stores put to the torch rather than seized by the enemy. It was war not of territory, but of survival. Caesar responded with ruthless efficiency. He called forth legions from winter quarters and crossed rivers swollen with spring floods. With his famed rapid marches, he struck rebel strongholds before they could fortify. He besieged Avaricum, a fortified oppidum of the Bituriges, despite pleas from the townspeople to spare it. Vercingetorix had advised the city be abandoned and destroyed, better lost than used by the Romans. But the locals insisted on resisting. Caesar encircled the city. His engineers built siege ramps and towers, all under driving rain and Gallic counterattacks. The defenders fought valiantly. But after a long and grinding siege, the Romans broke through. What followed was a massacre. Of the 40,000 inhabitants, almost all were slaughtered. Caesar, cold and calculating, offered no pardon. The city had defied him, it had to be made an example. Yet even this horror did not crush the resistance. Vercingetorix, watching from afar, did not retreat. Instead, he drew his forces to Gergovia, his native stronghold, a high, steep citadel almost impossible to assault. There, he would test Caesar directly. Caesar, confident from his recent victories, attempted the siege. But Gergovia was not Avaricum. Its slopes were steep, its defenders determined, and its walls strong. Worse, the Aedui, Caesar's Gallic allies, were wavering. Some had secretly joined Vercingetorix, driven by kinship or fear. Amidst this growing uncertainty, Caesar launched a premature assault, hoping to seize part of the city. It failed. The legions, confused by terrain and miscommunication, were repelled with heavy losses. Caesar was forced to retreat, one of the few outright defeats of his Gallic campaigns. Vercingetorix's prestige soared. More tribes flocked to his banner. Even the once hesitant Aedui began to waver. All Gaul now saw a real possibility that the Roman tide could be turned back. But Vercingetorix, ever cautious, still avoided open battle. His war was one of attrition, of forcing the Romans into difficult terrain, of bleeding them through raids and famine. It was working. Yet in the summer of that year, a decision would shift the tide once more, not through cunning, but necessity. Roman forces had besieged Alesia, a key stronghold in the territory of the Mandubii, where Vercingetorix had taken refuge with his army. Surrounded by hills and plains, Alesia offered strong defenses. But Caesar, knowing the importance of the moment, committed to one of the most extraordinary feats of siege warfare in ancient history. He ordered a circumvallation, a line of fortifications entirely surrounding the city, to starve the defenders inside. Then, anticipating that Gallic reinforcements might come, he built a second line, a contravallation, facing outward. In total, over 30 kilometers of ditches, ramparts, and towers encircled Alesia. It was an act of engineering brilliance and desperate defiance. Inside, Vercingetorix held firm. He sent messengers through enemy lines, calling all of Gaul to rise, to come and break the Roman ring. Across the land, warriors rallied. The final confrontation approached, not just for Alesia, but for the fate of Gaul itself. In the late summer of 52 BCE, as the leaves of the Gallic trees began to curl and the air turned sharp with harvest winds, the fate of an entire people drew toward a single, desperate stand. Alesia, perched upon a hill and surrounded by open plains, became the crucible into which the dreams of a united Gaul were poured. Inside its fortified walls, Vercingetorix and over 80,000 warriors held firm, Arverni, Bituriges, Cadurci, and others, the last great host of a rising that had burned brightly across the land. They were tired but unbroken, sustained by belief and by the hope that aid would come. And outside, encircling them like a tightening noose, stood Caesar, with 12 legions, siege towers, and 2 rings of defenses, one to starve the defenders, the other to repel rescuers. The inner wall faced Alesia, ditches, palisades, watchtowers, and traps. The outer wall, even larger, faced the countryside, prepared for the inevitable arrival of a Gallic relief force. That relief came. From across Gaul, tribes answered the call. A massive army, perhaps 250,000 strong, by Caesar's count, marched to Alesia. The commanders included Vercassivellaunus, a cousin of Vercingetorix, leading the cavalry. Their goal was simple: break through the Roman lines and lift the siege. For days, assaults thundered across the fields. The Gallic horse charged, the foot soldiers swarmed, and the skies echoed with the cries of war. From within Alesia, Vercingetorix launched coordinated sallies, hoping to stretch Roman forces to the breaking point. The attacks came day and night, at the palisades, the watchtowers, the trenches. But Caesar had prepared well. His fortifications held. Roman engineers repaired breaches under fire. Reserves moved swiftly between danger points. Arrows, stones, and javelins poured from the ramparts. The legions, hardened by years of war, endured. Then came the climactic assault. On a moonless night, Gallic forces struck at multiple points along the outer wall. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix led a final sortie from within. It was a moment of terror and near collapse. The Roman lines wavered. Caesar himself entered the fray, his red cloak visible atop a small hill, a rallying point for his troops. In the chaos, the tide turned. Roman cavalry, led by Labienus, swept around and struck the Gallic relief forces from the rear. Panic spread. The attackers broke and fled. Inside Alesia, hope crumbled. Vercingetorix, facing starvation, dwindling morale, and no path to victory, made a decision that would etch his name into legend. He rode out from Alesia and surrendered to Caesar. Dressed in armor, he presented himself not as a coward, but as a leader accepting the weight of failure. Accounts tell of Vercingetorix laying his weapons at Caesar's feet, a moment of solemn gravity when pride met fate. The siege was over. Gaul was broken. In the months that followed, scattered resistance flickered and died. The dream of a united Gaul, so briefly kindled, was extinguished. Caesar would spend the next year hunting remnants, subduing holdouts, and binding the provinces in Roman chains. Vercingetorix was taken in chains to Rome, where he languished in prison for 6 years. In 46 BCE, during Caesar's triumph, he was paraded through the streets, a living trophy of conquest. After the celebration, he was executed, likely by strangulation. But his death did not erase the memory. To the Gauls, he became a symbol, not of defeat, but of courage, unity, and lost freedom. His name would echo through the generations, long after the Roman legions had vanished. And Gaul, though Romanized, would never forget the man who dared to raise its tribes against empire. The fall of Alesia marked not just the end of a siege, it was the death knell of Gallic independence. The unity that Vercingetorix had forged, brief and fiery as a summer storm, had collapsed under the weight of Roman discipline, engineering, and persistence. With the Arverni defeated, their leader in chains, and their allies scattered or slain, the will of Gaul was shattered. The dream of a sovereign, united land, one not ruled by tribe, but by shared heritage, had flickered into darkness. Yet, the embers still smoldered. In the months that followed, resistance did not vanish, though it became fractured and desperate. Some tribes, like the Carnutes and the Bellovaci, attempted further uprisings. Small bands of warriors launched ambushes, sabotaged Roman supply lines, or took to the forests. Caesar responded with characteristic speed and severity, deploying his legions to stamp out the last sparks of rebellion. The Bellovaci, especially, under their leader Corius, made a final stand in 51 BCE, near the Axona River. Corius fought with the valor of his ancestors, but his army was surrounded and cut down. He died with sword in hand, the last noble of Gaul to face Caesar in open war. Elsewhere, the Treveri and Eburones, already decimated in previous years, were hunted relentlessly. Caesar, unwilling to leave behind an unstable province, ordered entire regions to be depopulated, their people either slain or sold into slavery. The memory of Ambiorix, who had once routed a Roman legion, now became ghost-like, for he vanished into the woods, never captured, never killed. His fate, unknown. His legend, enduring. Caesar now moved to consolidate power. He reorganized Gaul into administrative provinces, installed loyal tribal leaders as client rulers, and promoted the Romanization of cities and trade routes. Latin began to replace Gaulish in official matters. Roman coins circulated in markets. Roman temples rose beside Druidic groves. Where once had stood wooden palisades, now rose stone amphitheaters and aqueducts. But the conquest came at a terrible price. Ancient sources claim that over 1 million Gauls were killed during Caesar's campaigns, and another million enslaved, a figure debated, but indicative of vast suffering. Tribal cultures were uprooted, sacred traditions disrupted, and an entire generation of warriors extinguished. For Caesar, however, the rewards were immense. His campaigns in Gaul had transformed him from a Roman general into a legend. The riches of conquest, gold, slaves, and glory, flowed into his coffers. The loyalty of the legions, tested and proven, was now absolute. His written account, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, would present his actions as both noble and necessary, a civilizing mission against a barbaric world. Rome celebrated, but Gaul mourned. Still, all was not lost. Though the Gallic resistance had failed militarily, the spirit of the people endured. Their language, though suppressed, continued in rural places. The druids, though driven underground, passed their teachings in secret. And while Romanization altered the surface of life, beneath it lay the deep roots of a culture that had once stood proudly apart. In the centuries that followed, Gaul would become one of the richest provinces of the Roman Empire, its people adopting Roman dress, names, and customs. Yet they would also shape Rome in return, producing emperors, generals, and poets of their own. The blood of the Gauls flowed into the veins of empire. And through it all, the memory of Alesia, of Ambiorix, and of Vercingetorix remained, as symbols of what had been, and what had been lost. With the embers of resistance extinguished, Gaul entered a new era, one defined not by war, but by transformation. The Roman conquest, though brutal in its execution, was never solely about domination. It was about assimilation, and few places absorbed the Roman way more thoroughly, or more complexly, than Gaul. In the decades following the Gallic Wars, the region began to shed its old tribal skin, adopting Roman customs, laws, and infrastructure while preserving elements of its indigenous soul. At the heart of this new order stood Lugdunum, modern Lyon, founded in 43 BCE by Lucius Munatius Plancus, one of Caesar's lieutenants. It quickly became the administrative and spiritual center of Roman Gaul. Positioned at the confluence of the Rhone and Saône rivers, it linked Mediterranean trade routes with the northern frontier. From its marble forums and basilicas, Roman governors oversaw a vast and diverse land. Caesar's former conquests were now divided into 4 provinces. Gallia Narbonensis, the southern coast, Romanized early and thoroughly. Gallia Lugdunensis, central Gaul, stretching from Lyon to the Atlantic. Gallia Belgica, the northern lands, home of the once rebellious Belgae. Gallia Aquitania, the southwest, where Iberian and Gallic influences merged. Each province was governed by Roman officials, enforced by garrisons, and connected by an expanding network of roads, among the most advanced in the ancient world. These roads did more than move soldiers, they carried merchants, ideas, and culture. Latin became the language of law, trade, and administration, gradually replacing the diverse Celtic dialects of old. Cities blossomed. Nemausus, Nims, Arlate, Arles, Vienne, Autun, and Reims grew into vibrant Roman towns. Amphitheatres rose where druids had once held councils. Temples to Jupiter, Mars, and Augustus stood where groves had once whispered with Gaulish prayers. Aqueducts brought clean water to public baths. The Roman villa, with its columns, mosaics, and shaded courtyards, became the ideal of elite life. Yet, beneath this Roman veneer, Gaul was not erased. Many Gallic aristocrats adapted swiftly, becoming Roman citizens and senators, marrying into Italian families, and adopting Roman names. The Gallic nobility became Rome's local administrators, collecting taxes and maintaining order. In return, they received status, wealth, and protection. Meanwhile, rural Gauls, peasants, artisans, and farmers lived in a world where Roman and Gallic traditions intertwined. They worshipped not only Jupiter and Mercury, but also Epona, goddess of horses, and Tyrannes, the thunderer. Inscriptions from across Gaul show a fusion of deities, where Roman and Celtic gods were identified as one. The Druids, however, fared worse. Once the spiritual backbone of Gallic society, they were viewed by Rome as a threat, an independent authority rooted in tribal identity and resistance. Over time, Druidic practices were suppressed, especially under emperors like Tiberius and Claudius. Sacred groves were destroyed. Druidic gatherings banned. Yet, some continued in secret, and the wisdom of their oral traditions lingered in folk customs, healing practices, and seasonal rites. By the 1st century CE, a new generation had risen, born under Roman rule, but proud of Gallic blood. These were the Gallo-Romans, citizens of an empire, yet children of the land. They spoke Latin but remembered their heroes. They built temples with Roman columns, but offered sacrifice with Gallic rites. They served Rome in war, government, and commerce, yet in quiet moments, they still whispered the names of Ambiorix, Vercingetorix, and the old gods. This fusion, not a replacement, but a melding, would become the enduring legacy of Roman Gaul. It was no longer a land of scattered tribes and sacred groves. It was a province of Rome, civilized, connected, prosperous. But deep in its soul, Gaul remembered. And in time, those memories would awaken once more. By the early 1st century CE, the landscape of Gaul had changed so completely that a Gallic warrior from the days of Vercingetorix would scarcely have recognized it. Yet beneath the marble facades and orderly streets, a distinct cultural synthesis had emerged, one that blended the might and grandeur of Rome with the earthbound spirit of the Celtic past. This was the era of the Gallo-Romans, a people living in two worlds. In the cities, Roman life flourished. The grid-patterned streets led to forums filled with merchants, magistrates, and philosophers. Temples honored not only Roman gods, but also local deities now cloaked in Latin names. Public baths offered hygiene and gossip, and amphitheaters resounded with the cheers of crowds watching gladiators, sometimes Gauls themselves, trained in the deadly art. The upper classes, the descendants of Gallic nobles, had embraced Roman citizenship, often passed down from Caesar's time. They wore togas, read Latin poetry, and sent their sons to Rome to study law and rhetoric. Yet even in these refined homes, echoes of Gallic heritage persisted. Celtic jewelry, animal motifs, and ancestral symbols were kept alongside Roman art. In the countryside, life moved to a different rhythm. There, Roman villas dotted the land, working estates with columns and courtyards, but also barns, stables, and sacred household shrines. These estates were run by Gallo-Roman landowners who oversaw both Roman slaves and free Gallic labourers. The agricultural cycle, so central to Celtic life, continued much as it had before, though now enriched with Roman tools and practices. The average rural Gaul, a peasant farmer, smith, or herdsman, may never have seen a senator or visited a city, but he paid taxes to the empire and served in its armies. He might worship Mercury, yet also offer prayers to Sucellus, the Celtic god of the mallet, protector of the harvest and the forge. In religious life, syncretism was the rule. Roman and Celtic beliefs merged into something new, neither fully one nor the other. Local gods were adopted into Roman cults, their names Latinized, their shrines rebuilt in stone. Mercury, with his caduceus and fleet sandals, became especially popular in Gaul, often seen as a Roman reflection of Lugh, the Celtic god of commerce and light. The old Druidic traditions, driven underground, lingered in whispers, in healing rituals, seasonal festivals, and folk memory. Samhain, Imbolc, and Beltane were still observed, though now cloaked in new meanings. Sacred groves remained, not as centers of power, but as places of quiet reverence, kept alive by oral tradition. One of the most important transformations came in the form of education and literacy. Latin, once the language of occupation, became the language of learning. Gallic boys of noble birth learned to read and write, to recite Cicero and Virgil, and to participate in the cursus honorum, the Roman path of civic advancement. In towns like Autun, Augustodunum, schools were founded to educate the sons of provincial elites, preparing them to serve both Rome and their native land. Gauls now served not just in the local militias, but in the legions themselves, stationed as far as Syria, Britannia, and Africa. Their loyalty was no longer tribal, it was imperial. Veterans returned to Gaul with pay, honors, and land, building homes and spreading Roman values deeper into the rural heartlands. But even as Roman power deepened its hold, something subtle began to change. The memory of conquest faded, replaced by the routines of daily life. The grandchildren of those who had resisted Caesar now lived in a world where Rome was the norm, its power both inescapable and, to many, beneficial. Roads brought commerce. Laws brought stability. Baths, theatres, aqueducts, these were the gifts of empire. And yet, in fireside tales, in carved stone faces worn with time, in songs passed from mother to daughter, Gaul remembered. It remembered its heroes and gods, its forests and rites, its strength and sorrow. And though Rome had conquered the land, it had not extinguished the soul of its people. That soul would endure and one day rise again. By the 3rd century CE, the golden age of Roman Gaul began to show cracks. The signs were subtle at first: a decline in long-distance trade, the rising cost of defense, the erosion of civic duty. But beneath these early tremors lay deeper forces. The Roman Empire, once bound by discipline and shared purpose, now stretched thin across continents. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often through the swords of their own soldiers. Provinces were neglected, taxes increased, and legions became both protector and threat. In Gaul, the consequences were profound. The Rhine frontier, long guarded by Rome's finest, began to falter. Germanic tribes, the Franks, Alemanni, and Vandals, pushed across the river, not always in war, but often in waves of migration. Sometimes they came as raiders, sometimes as settlers. Roman cities were sacked, villas burned, and roads made unsafe. Towns once bustling with commerce turned inward, building walls where once they had stood open. To make matters worse, plague and famine struck intermittently, breaking both body and morale. The once prosperous countryside suffered. In some places, coinage disappeared, replaced by barter. The great estates remained, but smaller farms failed. Local economies collapsed into isolation. Amid this chaos, many turned to a new source of strength: Christianity. What had once been a persecuted sect, confined to underground gatherings and whispered creeds, now began to spread openly across Gaul. By the mid-3rd century, Christian communities appeared in Lyon, Arles, Tours, and Trier. Bishops, not governors, became voices of stability. Churches offered charity, sanctuary, and hope in a time of despair. The appeal was clear. Christianity offered not just salvation, but meaning, a vision of life beyond suffering, of justice beyond empire. It transcended tribal and class divisions, welcoming both slaves and nobles. Its message of spiritual equality contrasted with the rigid hierarchies of Rome. And unlike the fading gods of Olympus or the forest, the Christian God demanded not sacrifice, but faith. Yet conversion was not swift or universal. Rural areas, especially, held fast to the old ways. The pagan temples of Mercury, Mars, and Epona still stood. In the forests and hills, rites to the ancient gods persisted, now called paganus, the practices of country folk. Many Gallo-Romans quietly blended traditions, baptizing their children while still hanging amulets of tyrannies or invoking local spirits for harvests. Tensions rose. In cities, Christian bishops began to clash with Roman officials and traditional elites. Some emperors cracked down, others turned a blind eye. Persecutions flared, notably under Decius and Valerian, but rarely broke the will of the faithful. In fact, martyrdom became a powerful tool of conversion. Stories of men and women dying for their beliefs inspired awe and imitation. One such story was that of Saint Blandina of Lyon, a slave girl tortured and executed in the late 2nd century for her faith. Her courage under torment made her a symbol, not of weakness, but of strength born from conviction. By the dawn of the 4th century, the tide turned irrevocably. The Emperor Constantine, following his own vision before battle, embraced Christianity and legalized it through the Edict of Milan in 313 CE. Soon after, bishops were recognized as imperial officials. Churches gained land and privilege. Pagan temples began to close. The old order, already weakened by war and neglect, gave way to a new spiritual empire. In Gaul, this transition was especially vivid. Lyon, once a Roman capital, became a center of Christian theology. Martin of Tours, a former soldier turned monk and bishop, traveled the countryside spreading the faith, tearing down idols, and converting villages. His blend of compassion and determination would make him one of Gaul's most beloved saints. And yet, even as crosses replaced statues, the memory of the old gods lingered. They remained in place names, in seasonal festivals, in carved symbols worn by habit more than belief. Christian Gaul had emerged, but it still bore the deep imprint of a land that once bowed to no empire, and whose soul had always been shaped by the wild, the sacred, and the ancestral. The 4th and 5th centuries ushered in the twilight of Roman Gaul, a slow unraveling, not in a single cataclysm, but in the gradual erosion of certainty. Outwardly, the province remained Roman. Senators still met in gilded halls. Roads still bore the marks of legionary boots. Markets bustled, taxes were levied, and Latin filled the mouths of magistrates and priests. But beneath the surface, the structure was hollowing. The pillars of Roman strength, its legions, its bureaucracy, its economy, had begun to crack. One by one, the legions were withdrawn, sent to fight civil wars in Italy or defend the Danube frontier. The Rhine, once a bulwark against Germanic incursions, became porous. Trade slowed. Gold grew scarce. Villas were abandoned, towns shrank, and countryside estates fortified themselves like miniature strongholds. The people of Gaul, once citizens of an empire, now became guardians of their own fate. The great turning point came in 406 CE, when a coalition of Germanic tribes, including the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, crossed the frozen Rhine near Mogontiacum, modern Mainz. The frontier was overrun. Roman defenses crumbled. Panic spread across the land. The invaders swept through Belgica and Aquitania, pillaging and settling. Some tribes, like the Burgundians and Franks, would later be co-opted as Roman foederati, federated allies, but others carved their own kingdoms from the carcass of the empire. The illusion of Roman control had been shattered. By 451 CE, a final, desperate stand took shape. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, stormed across Gaul with terrifying speed, burning and slaughtering as they came. But in a strange twist of fate, Roman Gaul's salvation came not from within, but from without. Flavius Aetius, the last great Roman general in the West, rallied a mixed army of Romans, Visigoths, and Gallo-Roman militias to face Attila at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. The battle, fought near Chalons, was a savage clash. Though indecisive, it halted Attila's advance. Gaul breathed, barely, but the cost was clear. Rome no longer stood as a monolith, but as a fragile coalition of allies and fading authority. In 476 CE, the final blow fell. The Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. The empire in the West was no more. In Gaul, what remained of Roman administration disintegrated. Cities became islands of memory. Bishops stepped into the roles once held by governors. The Latin tongue persisted, but it now bore the accents of the countryside, evolving slowly into early forms of Romance speech. Over time, new powers rose. In northern Gaul, the Franks, under Clovis, established a kingdom that would give rise to France. In the east, the Burgundians carved out their own territory. In southern Gaul, Visigoths established their seat in Toulouse, ruling a realm that stretched into Spain. Yet even in this age of fragmentation and war, Roman Gaul did not vanish entirely. Its laws, its language, its architecture, and Christian faith endured. The Roman ideal of city, citizenship, and civic order was not destroyed, but transformed. It was now carried forward by new peoples, reshaped to suit new realities. And among the people, in churches and fields, in abbeys and hearthside tales, the stories of the old world survived, of Vercingetorix, of Alesia, of the ancient tribes who once dared defy an empire. Gaul had fallen, but in that fall, a new world had begun to rise. As the centuries passed and the fires of the Roman world grew cold, the memory of the Gauls endured, not just in stone and script, but in the imagination of their descendants. In post-Roman Gaul, now a patchwork of Frankish, Gothic, and Burgundian kingdoms, identity was in flux. Latin was spoken, but with new inflections. The Christian Church grew powerful, anchoring communities through chaos. And yet, among these transformations, the past still whispered, in names, in stories, and in ruins. The Gauls, once feared and admired by Rome, were slowly woven into the foundational myths of a new Europe. Their memory took many forms. In the Christian chronicles of the early medieval period, Gaul's past was filtered through moral and providential lenses. The conquest by Caesar was sometimes framed as divine punishment for paganism, or as the necessary prelude to Christian civilization. The druids, once the spiritual heart of the tribes, were reimagined, sometimes as wise sages, other times as sinister sorcerers. But even as official histories buried the Gallic identity beneath layers of Roman and Christian narrative, folk memory did not forget. In the countryside, old hillforts were still called oppida, and many were believed to be the homes of ancient kings or heroes. Springs and groves, once sacred to Celtic gods, remained places of pilgrimage, now sanctified in Christian terms, but still tied to the land's ancient rhythms. Vercingetorix, especially, lingered as a figure of fascination. Though vilified in some Roman accounts, his name was remembered as the man who had dared defy Caesar, as the chieftain who had united the tribes, even if only briefly. In time, medieval bards and poets would resurrect his story, adding flourishes of romance and chivalry. He became a symbol of lost sovereignty, a tragic hero from a golden age when Gaul stood free. This mythologizing only deepened in later centuries. During the Renaissance, with the rediscovery of classical texts, scholars revisited the Gallic Wars, and with them, the figure of Vercingetorix. He was no longer just a rebel, but a proto-national figure, a man of vision and courage who resisted foreign domination. In the 19th century, amid the rise of nationalism, especially in France, the memory of the Gauls was reborn with new urgency. Historians, artists, and politicians seized upon Gallic heritage as a foundation for modern identity. Schools taught children that they were descended from brave Gauls who had once resisted tyranny. Statues of Vercingetorix were erected, the most famous at Alesia, commissioned by Napoleon III in 1865, depicting him with flowing hair, chainmail, and defiant posture. In literature, the Gauls appeared not just in histories, but in novels, plays, and popular tales. Even in comic books, most famously Asterix Le Gaulois, a 20th-century satire, the Gauls lived again, cunning and proud, resisting the might of Rome with humor and heart. But beyond the myths and modern appropriations, the true legacy of the Gauls lies in what they became. They did not disappear. They transformed. Their blood flowed into the Franks, the Gallo-Romans, the Merovingians. Their language, shaped by Latin and time, became French, Occitan, and other Romance tongues. Their customs, reshaped by Christianity and empire, endured in rural traditions, festivals, and beliefs. Their lands became the heart of medieval Christendom, and later, the core of the modern French nation. And their spirit, independent, tribal, proud, still flickers in the identity of a people who remember. For the Gauls were never just a vanished tribe. They were a foundation, a people of the forests and rivers, of war cries and sacred groves, of iron and soul. Rome conquered them, but in the end, it was their descendants who carried forward the torch of memory. For centuries, the story of the Gauls was known primarily through the words of their conquerors, Julius Caesar, Livy, Diodorus Siculus. These accounts, though invaluable, bore the perspective of Rome, emphasizing Gallic savagery, disunity, and ultimate submission. But in the modern age, a new voice has emerged, not from scroll or sword, but from earth and stone. It is the voice of archaeology. Beneath the fields of France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Germany, the Gauls left traces of their world, settlements, tools, weapons, ceramics, coins, ritual objects, and burial mounds. These remnants, silent for 2 millennia, now speak with growing clarity, revealing a civilization far richer and more complex than Roman propaganda once allowed. Excavations at sites like Bibracte, Alesia, Gergovia, and Lartene have illuminated the breadth of Gallic life. These were not mere hill-dwelling warriors. They were skilled metallurgists, craftspeople, traders, and builders. Their oppida, fortified towns, show evidence of urban planning, markets, and international commerce, reaching as far as the Mediterranean and the British Isles. The Lartene culture, in particular, has become central to understanding late Iron Age Gaul. Named after a lakeside site in Switzerland, it represents the artistic and material flowering of Celtic Europe from around 450 BCE to the Roman conquest. Artifacts from Lartene, with intricate curvilinear designs, stylized animals, and fine metalwork, reflect a people of aesthetic sophistication and spiritual depth. Funerary practices further expand our view. Burial mounds in places like Vix and Humeburg have yielded treasures, bronze vessels, chariots, imported Greek and Etruscan goods, and the remains of nobles laid to rest in grandeur. These discoveries challenge the old view of the Gauls as primitive or backward. They were part of a pan-European cultural network, trading ideas and artifacts across distances once thought improbable. Religious life, once obscured by Caesar's accounts of druidic ritual and human sacrifice, is also being reassessed. Sacred sites such as Ribemontserencre and Roquepetus have revealed altars, statues, and ceremonial deposits. While some evidence suggests sacrificial practices, it is increasingly clear that Gallic religion was complex and varied, with deep reverence for nature, cycles, and ancestral spirits. The druids, once dismissed as mystics or rebels, are now understood as scholars, judges, and spiritual leaders, central to tribal governance and education. Perhaps most transformative has been the study of Gallic inscriptions. While the Gauls left no grand literature, their culture being largely oral, scattered inscriptions in Gaulish, written in Greek or Latin script, have begun to reveal elements of the spoken language. Though limited, these texts offer glimpses into everyday life, names, dedications, prayers. They serve as a reminder that the Gauls had a voice, even if it was long silenced. Modern scholarship has also re-examined the political structures of the tribes. Far from being leaderless or chaotic, many Gallic societies featured elected magistrates, councils of elders, and sophisticated systems of intertribal alliances. Power was often negotiated, not imposed. Leadership, while occasionally hereditary, required support and consensus, a fact that made Caesar's conquest all the more difficult. In recent decades, interdisciplinary approaches, combining archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and historical analysis, have further enriched our picture of Gallic life. And what emerges is a portrait not of barbarians at the gate, but of a vibrant civilization, one that thrived for centuries before Rome, and whose influence persisted long after. The Gauls are no longer just the defeated. They are a people rediscovered, honored not for their fall, but for the world they built, a world now slowly, lovingly unearthed. Long before Latin echoed through the forums of Gaul, another language filled its valleys, forests, and stone-built oppida, the soft, rhythmic voice of the Gaulish tongue. Spoken from the Seine to the Garonne, from the Alps to the Atlantic, Gaulish was one of the many continental Celtic languages, close kin to the dialects of the Britons and Galatians, distant cousins of the later Welsh, Irish, and Breton. It was the language of druids and traders, of chieftains and craftsmen, and though largely unwritten, it formed the soul of Gallic identity. We know today that Gaulish was not a single dialect, but a family of closely related tongues, shaped by tribal variations, geography, and contact with other cultures, especially the Greeks and Etruscans, and later, the Romans. Words and phrases passed through oral memory, shaped by bards and bound by custom. It was in this spoken form that laws were recited, lineages preserved, and sacred rites performed. Written Gaulish, though rare, has survived. Carved into stone steles, pottery shards, and metal votive objects, inscriptions in Greek and later Latin alphabets offer glimpses into the language. We read personal names, dedications to gods, occasional legal formulae. One of the longest surviving texts is the colony calendar, a bronze tablet discovered in eastern Gaul, etched with a complex lunisolar timekeeping system. Written in Roman script but Gaulish language, it reveals a people deeply attuned to natural cycles and ritual time. From such texts, linguists have reconstructed elements of Gaulish vocabulary and grammar. We know words like Dumnos, world or underworld; Nemeton, sacred grove; Teutates, a tribal or godly name; Rix, king or leader, as in Vercingetorix. Place names, too, preserve linguistic heritage. Many modern towns bear names rooted in Gaulish origins. Lugdunum, modern Lyon, fortress of Lug, a Celtic god of light. Nemeticum, Arras, sacred grove. Cenabum, Orleans, possibly meaning river village. These names, weathered by time, stand as linguistic fossils, memories etched into geography. With the Roman conquest, Gaulish slowly yielded to Latin. The process was neither sudden nor complete. In cities and trade hubs, Latin became dominant swiftly. But in rural areas, especially in the Massif Central, Armorica, and the Pyrenean fringes, Gaulish persisted for generations. Some scholars suggest it remained spoken well into the 5th century, and perhaps beyond, blending with Latin into unique local dialects. Indeed, many loanwords from Gaulish entered Latin, and from there, filtered into French. Brière heather. Chain, oak. Alouette, lark. Rousseau, stream. These are not just words, they are echoes. They tell us what the Gauls saw, what they valued, how they described their world. In the Breton language, still spoken in parts of northwestern France, some scholars detect fragments of this ancient heritage. Though more closely related to later British Celtic tongues, it carries the spirit of a Celtic past that never wholly died. Today, efforts to understand Gaulish continue. Linguists and historians pore over inscriptions, reimagine pronunciation, and even attempt spoken reconstructions. Though the language faded from daily use long ago, its imprint remains, in names, in land, and in the resonance of memory. For the Gauls, language was not merely communication, it was identity, tradition, power. And though their voices have fallen silent, their words still whisper from the stones. Among all the images of ancient Gaul, the fierce warrior, the hilltop oppidum, the spiraled Jewry, none looms more mysteriously than the druid. Neither priest nor prophet in the Roman sense, the druid stood as the spiritual and intellectual pillar of Gallic society, wielding a power that rivaled kings. To the Gauls, the druids were teachers, judges, healers, and seers. To the Romans, they were both awe-inspiring and dangerous, respected for their wisdom, feared for their influence. According to Caesar, writing in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, the Druids held authority across tribal lines. They mediated disputes, conducted sacrifices, and taught a vast oral tradition that required years of memorization. The education of a Druid could last 2 decades, and it was done entirely by voice, no sacred texts, no written dogma. Knowledge was considered too sacred to be entrusted to ink and parchment. This oral system preserved not just ritual knowledge, but laws, cosmology, genealogies, and myths, the entire intellectual framework of Celtic civilization. Druidic schools were said to exist in sacred groves, away from the noise of settlements, where students would gather to listen, recite, and contemplate. The Druids' religious role was equally profound. They acted as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Rituals, often seasonal and communal, were held in nemata, sacred groves or open-air temples. Sacrifice was central to these rites, animals, and perhaps in rare and symbolic cases, humans. Caesar claimed that criminals were sometimes burned in wicker figures, offerings to appease divine wrath. Whether these accounts are exaggerated Roman propaganda or echoes of genuine practices remains a matter of scholarly debate. What is certain is that the Druids believed in the immortality of the soul. Death was not an end but a passage. This belief, perhaps akin to a form of reincarnation, lent the Gauls a celebrated fearlessness in battle. Warriors did not die, they merely journeyed. The Druids also observed the natural world with reverence. They marked time by the movements of the moon, held trees, especially the oak, as sacred, and collected mistletoe with golden sickles, chanting as they worked. Waters, hills, and forests all held spirits. Every act of life was part of a cosmic balance, a truth taught, upheld, and interpreted by the Druids. Politically, Druids were powerful mediators. They could intervene in tribal feuds, convene assemblies, and even declare ritual warfare unjust. Their judgments carried weight across tribal boundaries. In times of unrest, the Druids might unify leaders, or stand apart in protest. This autonomy, however, made them threatening to Rome. As the conquest of Gaul advanced, Roman authorities sought not only to subdue warriors, but to silence the Druids. Emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius issued edicts banning their practices. Sacred groves were destroyed, ceremonies outlawed, Druidic schools closed. Yet resistance endured, especially in remote or forested regions, where old customs persisted in secrecy. Some scholars suggest that in later centuries, elements of Druidic thought were absorbed into Christian monasticism, the reverence for wisdom, the cloistered life of study, the connection to nature. Others see echoes in medieval bardic traditions, in the myths of Arthur and Merlin, or in the poetic laws of Ireland and Wales. But in Gaul itself, the Druids faded. By the early medieval period, their voice had vanished from the official record. What remained were memories of men in white robes, speaking truths older than cities, gathering beneath the oak to remind a people of their place in the great wheel of time. Today, we look back with both curiosity and humility. The Druids left no texts, no creeds, only the reverent silence of the forest, and the scattered impressions of those who feared or admired them. Yet in that silence lies a wisdom still sought, a sense that life, law, and the land are bound by something deeper than conquest or coin. In the tapestry of ancient Gaul, the image of the Gallic woman emerges not as a shadow behind the warrior, but as a figure of remarkable presence, dignity, and strength. Roman observers, often startled by what they saw, remarked frequently on the freedom and respect afforded to Gallic women. To them, steeped in Roman patriarchy, it seemed strange, even unsettling, that women might speak in councils, hold property, or accompany warriors into battle. Yet this was the world of the Gauls, a society where gender roles, though distinct, were not entirely unequal. In the household, women were not mere caretakers but often managers of estates, especially during times when men were away on raids or war. They oversaw the harvest, organized festivals, and held sway over family decisions. Among the nobility, women could wield significant economic and political influence, acting as negotiators in marriages, alliances, and even tribal disputes. Marriage in Gaul, as Caesar observed, was a contract of shared interest. Though polygyny was known, many marriages were monogamous, and women could bring dowries, maintain their own property, and in some cases, inherit lands. The fusion of family lines through marriage was a strategic tool, one in which women played active roles. But it was in the religious and symbolic spheres that Gallic women most clearly stepped into public view. Among the Druidic orders, there were female practitioners, seeresses, healers, and keepers of sacred lore. While the male Druid dominated the Roman imagination, evidence from across Celtic Europe suggests that women held spiritual authority, especially in ritual purification, divination, and seasonal rites. One powerful archetype was the prophetess, a woman imbued with divine sight, consulted before battles, oracles in flowing robes, speaking with the voice of the gods. Roman writers, including Tacitus and Strabo, record instances of Celtic women leading ceremonies, often in coastal sanctuaries or forested groves, far from Roman control. And in times of war, women could take up the mantle of defenders. Though not common as frontline warriors, Gallic women were known to fight when their homes were threatened. Ancient authors speak of them urging their men forward, brandishing torches, or defending walls with stones and boiling water. Their presence in the war effort was symbolic and real, a reflection of a society where courage was not solely the province of men. Consider the image, preserved in Roman memory, of the women of Jugovia, crying out from the battlements as Roman forces approached, not in fear, but in defiance, shaming their men into standing fast. Or the accounts of Gallic matrons cursing Roman invaders, invoking the gods to blind and scatter them. Even the legal traditions of the Gauls, preserved in fragments and reflected in early Irish law, hint at a world where women could be landholders, judges, and guardians of kinship ties. Their word, especially in matters of lineage and inheritance, carried legal weight. The Romanization of Gaul would gradually alter this balance. Under Roman rule, patriarchal customs deepened. Roman law restricted women's rights to inherit and govern. The public roles of women diminished, especially in urban centers where Latin custom replaced tribal norms. Christianity, for all its spiritual equality, also promoted ideals of female modesty and domesticity, further narrowing the sphere in which women could act. Yet the memory of powerful women lingered in legend and lore. From the fair warrior maidens of Celtic myth, to the noble matriarchs of medieval chanson, the Gallic woman remained a symbol of continuity, the hearth keeper, the healer, the whisperer of ancestral truths. And in modern scholarship, she has returned once more, not merely as companion to the Gaul, but as his equal in spirit, shaping the culture, the resistance, and the identity of a people that refused to vanish. Long before Roman roads stitched the provinces together, the Gauls were already a people of movement, exchange, and commerce. Their world was not an isolated patchwork of tribal villages, but a vibrant crossroads, a place where goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across rivers and forests, carried by wagon, boat, and foot. The wealth of Gaul came first from its land. Fertile plains grew grain and vegetables, while forests yielded timber, resin, and game. Vast herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs roamed its pastures. Mines in regions like Armorica and the Massif Central produced iron, copper, lead, and even gold, some of it drawn from riverbeds with remarkable ingenuity. These resources formed the backbone of a self-sustaining economy, but they also fed a far-reaching trade network. Even in pre-Roman times, the Gauls engaged in long-distance trade. The Rhône and Seine, the Loire, and the Garonne acted as natural highways, linking inland tribes to the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. By the 5th century BCE, Greek merchants from Massalia, modern Marseille, were exchanging wine, ceramics, and luxury goods for salt, metals, and slaves. Wine, in particular, was prized. Amphorae bearing Greek and later Roman stamps have been found deep within the heart of Gaul, in Oppida far from the coasts. The elite drank from imported cups, feasted on delicacies, and even adopted foreign styles of dress and ceremony, blending them with their own. And in return, the Gauls offered more than raw materials. They were craftspeople of skill. They produced fine metalwork, torcs, brooches, and weapons etched with intricate designs. Their pottery, while often undecorated, was sturdy and widespread. Glass beads, dyed textiles, and leather goods also traveled across tribal borders. Some Gallic artisans specialized in horse gear, sought after for both function and style. In some places, coinage was minted, first imitating Greek and Roman models, later evolving into uniquely Gallic forms, often bearing stylized horses, eagles, or tribal symbols. Marketplaces emerged at seasonal gatherings, often aligned with religious festivals, where tribes exchanged goods, settled disputes, and forged alliances. These fairs, both spiritual and economic, acted as focal points of community life. With the Roman conquest came both disruption and expansion. At first, war disrupted trade routes. Cities were sacked, population scattered. But as Roman control stabilized, new economic structures emerged. Roads such as the Via Agrippa connected the interior to the Mediterranean in ways never before possible. Roman merchants flooded in, bringing oil, wine, garum, fish sauce, glassware, and textiles. The economy of Gaul shifted, becoming monetized, urbanized, and increasingly dependent on imperial networks. Villas and estates now produce not only for local consumption, but for imperial markets. Gallic wine, once a curiosity, became a staple export. Salt from Burgundy, pottery from Lisieux, and iron from Noricum all found their way to Rome, Britannia, and beyond. This integration enriched many Gallic elites. They became patrons of towns, funders of temples, and sponsors of games. Their wealth now rested not just on ancestral lands, but on their ability to navigate Roman systems, taxes, trade, and tribute. Yet, not all benefited. As wealth concentrated, rural inequality deepened. Small farmers were often absorbed into large estates. Others migrated to towns in search of work. Economic crises, including plagues, invasions, and inflation, periodically struck, especially in the 3rd and 4th centuries. But even in decline, the framework of Roman Gallic commerce endured. Through war and peace, the Gauls had always been a people of exchange, not only of goods, but of ideas, technologies, and traditions. They borrowed, adapted, and reimagined. And in that alchemy of trade, their culture was never lost, only transformed. Before cities lined the Roman roads, before aqueducts arched across Gallic valleys, there were the Oppida, the great fortified towns of pre-Roman Gaul. These were not mere hillforts or encampments, they were centers of power, trade, ritual, and identity, rising across the land like crowns upon the hills. From the 3rd century BCE, the oppidum became the heart of Gallic urban life. Built atop naturally defensible positions, ridges, plateaus, or river bends, these settlements were enclosed by massive walls, often constructed in the Murus Gallicus style, timber frameworks filled with rubble, faced with stone, and reinforced with iron spikes. This was not crude architecture, but a sophisticated blend of durability and engineering. Within these walls lay thriving communities. Each oppidum had its own layout, sometimes ordered, sometimes organic, shaped by local geography and tradition. Central areas might host markets, council spaces, and shrines. Skilled artisans worked in wood, metal, and clay, while farmers brought in grain, livestock, and produce from surrounding lands. It was in these places that the tribes came together, decisions were made, and leaders rose to prominence. Some oppida were enormous. Bibract, in the land of the Aedui, sprawled across 200 hectares, larger than many Roman towns. Gergovia, high upon its hill, defied Caesar himself. Avaricum, nestled by a river, was so well planned and prosperous that Caesar called it the finest city in all of Gaul. Their names, now half forgotten, once rang with pride. But the oppidum was more than a fortress, it was a mirror of Gallic society. Here, aristocracy and commoners, warriors and merchants, druids and farmers, all mingled. Decisions were made in public assemblies or among noble councils. Feasts and festivals marked the turning of seasons. The dead were honored, the gods appeased, an oath sworn. When the Romans came, they recognized the strategic and symbolic importance of these sites. Some were destroyed, like Alesia, razed after its fall to Caesar. Others were transformed into Roman towns, their wooden streets replaced with stone forums, their tribal halls with basilicas, and their sacred groves with temples of Jupiter. New cities rose atop old foundations. Lugdunum, Lyon, built at the confluence of two rivers, became the capital of Roman Gaul. Augustodunum, Autun, a planned Roman city, replaced Bibract and inherited its civic prestige. Nemausus, Nims, and Alate, Arles, flourished with Roman theatres, baths, and amphitheatres. In these cities, the Gallo-Roman world was forged. Roman architecture reshaped the landscape, roads laid in grid patterns, aqueducts carrying water, villas built with mosaics and hypocausts. Yet the people who walked those streets still bore Gallic names, wore Celtic jewelry, and practiced old customs behind closed doors. Urban life in Roman Gaul was diverse and stratified. At its top were Roman citizens, often local nobles who had adopted Latin customs and gained senatorial rank. Beneath them were freedmen, artisans, and traders. Slaves, too, formed a significant part of urban life, working in homes, workshops, and farms. Markets thrived. Goods flowed in from Spain, Africa, and Italy, wine, oil, spices, and luxury items, but local crafts also remained vital. Potters, smiths, weavers, and builders found steady work. Religious life flourished as temples to Roman gods rose beside older sanctuaries. And, over time, churches began to appear, built by Christian communities growing in number and confidence. Still, the memory of the Oppida lived on. Even as their stones were buried under Roman cities, their names endured in oral tradition, and their legacy in the civic pride of later generations. The transformation from oppidum to Roman town was not destruction, but adaptation, a testament to the Gallic spirit, which bent to empire but was never broken. Urban life in Gaul became the crucible where past and future met, the place where a Celtic people embraced new forms without forgetting who they were. The Gauls, though so often remembered for their swords and shields, were not a people of war alone. They were also a people of art, expressive, symbolic, and deeply rooted in their vision of the world. Their aesthetic was not born of marble columns or symmetry. It flowed instead from the spiral, the curve, the living line, a style as fluid as the rivers of their homeland, as intricate as the branches of the sacred oak. Where Roman art sought realism and order, Gallic art reveled in abstraction, rhythm, and transformation. From the earliest days of the Hallstatt and Latine cultures, the great Celtic traditions that preceded the Roman conquest, Gallic craftsmen produced works that dazzled with their complexity and energy. These were not idle decorations, but symbols of power, protection, and the sacred. Among the most iconic forms were the torcs, heavy neck rings of twisted gold, bronze, or iron, worn by warriors, nobles, and sometimes gods. These were not merely ornaments, they were badges of honor, symbols of social rank and divine favor. The Roman historian Livy tells of Gallic warriors entering battle with nothing but their torcs and trousers, proud and unafraid. Torcs were often engraved with zoomorphic patterns, snakes, birds, and boars, each animal carrying its own symbolic charge. The boar, in particular, was sacred to many tribes, fierce, untamable, and resilient. Weapons, too, were not just functional but adorned with art. Swords had hilts shaped like beasts. Shields bore intricate bosses and swirling designs. Helmets, like the famous Amfreville helmet or the Sumesti bird crest, featured stylized crests of birds in flight, bronze wings outstretched, as if the warrior might take flight in the fury of battle. Ceramics from Latine sites show a preference for flowing forms, not geometric patterns, but organic, interlaced motifs, hinting at water, fire, and life itself. These same patterns appear on metalwork, carved stones, and even wooden items, now lost to time but glimpsed through archaeological remains. And then there were the faces. Gallic artists created stylized representations of the human head, elongated, abstract, with prominent eyes or mustaches. The head, in Celtic belief, was the seat of the soul, the essence of being. It appears again and again in sculpture and relief, severed, worshipped, displayed. At Roquepetus and Entremont, archaeologists have found stone pillars into which real human skulls were once placed, offerings or trophies, perhaps, or reminders of ancestral spirits. These eerie, reverent monuments speak to a belief system where life and death were not opposites, but part of a larger cycle. The Gallic relationship with the natural world shaped much of their art. Trees, rivers, animals, and the stars were not just part of the environment, they were alive with meaning. Their gods took animal forms or bore animal companions. Their myths were populated with shapeshifters and guardians of the wild. This worldview found expression in amulets, idols, and sacred carvings, many of which blur the line between human and beast. After the Roman conquest, Gallic art did not vanish, it transformed. Gallic artists began to work in Roman styles, producing mosaics, reliefs, and sculptures in marble and bronze. But even then, they left their mark. A Roman villa might display a floor mosaic with geometric precision, but the figures dancing across it might wear Celtic torcs or hold sacred animals. The fusion of Roman form with Gallic spirit produced something new, Gallo-Roman art, elegant yet alive, formal yet personal. Religious art especially reflected this synthesis. In shrines and temples across Roman Gaul, gods like Mercury, Mars, and Epona were depicted with both Roman and Celtic attributes. Mercury, god of commerce, was sometimes shown with Celtic knotted patterns. Epona, protector of horses, was uniquely Gallic but accepted into the Roman pantheon, shown riding side saddle, surrounded by offerings. In this way, Gallic art remained not just a memory, but a living force, evolving with time yet always true to its roots, dynamic, symbolic, and deeply human. It was the visual voice of a people who saw the world not in straight lines, but in spirals, cycles, and sacred forms. Every people carries with them a pantheon of heroes, those figures who, whether historical or mythic, define the soul of a culture. For the Gauls, such figures lived not in marble tombs or on bronze plaques, but in story, song, and ancestral memory. Their names echoed in feasting halls, invoked by bards around the fire. Some were warriors. Some were kings. Others were wise and wild, moving between the worlds of gods and men. Foremost among them stands Vercingetorix, the last great unifier, remembered less for victory than for defiance. His name, meaning Overking of Warriors, carries weight even now. Captured and paraded through Rome, he became a martyr in the eyes of his people, not merely a general, but a symbol of unity, a beacon of what Gaul could have been. But he was not the first, nor the only. Earlier tales spoke of Brennus, a chieftain who, around 390 BCE, led a host of Gauls into the heart of Rome itself. According to Roman legend, after sacking the city, Brennus demanded gold in tribute. When the Romans protested the use of weighted scales, he threw his sword upon the balance and cried, "Vae victis!" Woe to the vanquished! True or not, the story reveals how deeply the Gauls could inspire both fear and admiration in their foes. There was another Brennus, too, a generation later, who led Gallic tribes into Greece and besieged Delphi, the sacred heart of Hellenic culture. Though ultimately defeated, the audacity of the campaign shocked the ancient world. Even centuries later, the Greeks remembered the northern barbarians who dared challenge their gods. Among the Belgae, tales tell of Ambiorix, the elusive guerrilla leader of the Eburones, who ambushed and annihilated a Roman legion in 54 BCE. Though his tribe was hunted to near extinction, Ambiorix vanished into legend, never caught, never killed, remembered for his cunning and courage. To the Romans, he was a thorn, to his people, a fox among wolves. Beyond the battlefield, the Gauls honored figures of wisdom and myth, druids, kings, and semi-divine beings whose stories blurred the line between history and poetry. One such figure is Cernunnos, the horned god, lord of the forest and wild beasts. Though not a hero in the martial sense, his image, seated cross-legged, antlered, surrounded by serpents and stags, evoked the primal forces of nature that the Gauls revered. To commune with Cernunnos was to understand life, death, and the untamed world. Others were culture bringers, like the shadowy Lugus, god of light, commerce, and wisdom, possibly reflected in the name Lugdunum, Leon. He, like Hermes to the Greeks or Mercury to the Romans, was seen as a guide and protector, a bridge between tribes and times. Even in the early Christian period, when such stories were frowned upon, legends persisted. In Brittany and the Oven, in the Pyrenees and Ardennes, local tales kept alive the memory of ancient warriors and wise women, of giants and saints, of lost kings sleeping beneath hills, awaiting a time of return. In these tales, fact and fiction are inseparable. They are not meant to be precise. They are meant to be true in spirit, reflecting the values the Gauls held dear: bravery, loyalty, honor, cleverness, and connection to the land. And in remembering these figures, Vercingetorix, Brennus, Ambiorix, and the countless unnamed heroes, we do not simply recount the past. We touch the heartbeat of a people who, though conquered, never allowed their soul to be silenced. In the lives of the ancient Gauls, time was not linear, but circular. The seasons turned not as a march, but as a wheel, a great, sacred cycle of birth, growth, death, and renewal. Every phase of this wheel was marked with ritual, every turn acknowledged with ceremony and reverence. Though little survives in written form, archaeology and early medieval sources allow us to glimpse the Gallic calendar, and with it, the spiritual rhythm that guided their world. One of the most striking pieces of evidence is the colony calendar, discovered in fragments near Lyon. Dating to the 2nd century CE, this bronze tablet, inscribed in Gaulish using Latin letters, lays out a lunisolar calendar of 62 months, with intercalary corrections to align the lunar cycle with the solar year. Each month bore a name, poetic and mysterious: Simonios, Dumanios, Rivros, Anagantios, terms tied perhaps to weather, crops, or deities now obscured by time. More revealing still are the notations within the calendar. Days were marked as MAT, good, ANM, not good, or MD, uncertain, indicating which days were suitable for religious observance, public gatherings, or sacred rituals. The Gauls, it seems, lived by a spiritual almanac, where time itself was sacred territory, to be navigated with care. The Gaulish year began, most likely, with Simonios, around the modern autumn, when the harvest was gathered, and the veil between worlds grew thin. This was likely the origin of Samhain, preserved later in Celtic tradition, a festival of endings and beginnings, of ancestor veneration and quiet dread. Other festivals likely aligned with seasonal shifts. Imbolc, in late winter, honored the first stirrings of spring, a time of light and purification. Beltane, in early May, celebrated fertility, fire, and the return of life to the land. Lunasad, in late summer, gave thanks for the harvest, named for the god Lugus, a divine bringer of order and skill. While the names vary across Celtic regions, the themes remain constant: reverence for nature, alignment with cosmic rhythms, and communal renewal. Rituals accompanied these cycles, not merely as festivals, but as acts of cosmic participation. Fires were lit on hills, their flames meant to purify and protect. Cattle were driven between twin blazes for blessing. Offerings of grain, milk, or the first fruits were made to the gods and spirits of place. In times of hardship, more solemn rites might include sacrifice, human or animal, to restore the balance. Such ceremonies were led by druids, but enacted by the community. They were not performances, but lived expressions of belief. Through ritual, the Gauls affirmed their place in the great web of existence, among their kin, their land, and the divine. Even in the rhythms of daily life, this sacred sense of time persisted. The new moon might herald a journey. The solstice a day of decision. Children were born under auspicious signs. Oaths were made according to the stars. The Roman conquest brought new calendars, the Julian year, imperial festivals, and bureaucratic timekeeping. But beneath the official record, old customs continued, often absorbed into Roman or later Christian forms. All Saints' Day, Easter fires, May poles, harvest festivals, these are not inventions, but adaptations, echoing the deeper cadence of Gallic time. Today, we often think of calendars as tools to organize, to plan, to measure. But to the Gauls, time was not a thing to manage. It was a living force, a rhythm of the sacred world, calling them to remember who they were, and to walk in harmony with the turning of the wheel. To understand the Gauls fully, one must also look through the eyes of their conquerors, the Romans, who observed them with a mixture of fascination, contempt, and grudging respect. For it is through Roman pens that much of what we know was first written, their words both illuminating and distorting. The earliest Roman encounters with the Gauls were traumatic. In 390 BCE, Rome was sacked by a band of Senones under Brennus. This searing memory would haunt Roman consciousness for centuries. The Gauls became, in Roman literature, the archetype of barbarian chaos, tall, wild-haired, loud in speech, and terrifying in battle. Writers such as Livy, Polybius, and Pliny the Elder painted a vivid, though often exaggerated, picture of men with chalked hair, golden torcs, and piercing eyes, who fought with fury and laughed in the face of death. They were described as childlike, easily swayed by emotion, brave but undisciplined, hospitable yet treacherous. Caesar, in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico, offers the most detailed, and the most politically motivated, account. Writing to justify his own military campaigns, he portrayed the Gauls as divided, prone to internal feuds, and incapable of unified resistance. And yet, even as he framed them as suitable for conquest, he could not hide their virtues. He admired their courage, their cultural refinement in certain regions, and their religious intensity. His accounts of Vercingetorix and the resistance at Alesia reveal a grudging admiration for a formidable foe. Other Roman authors highlighted the exoticism of Gallic life, their rituals, their druids, their music and banquets. The Gauls were said to debate over wine, to weep with joy and rage in equal measure, to boast of ancestral deeds in song. Their festivals, it was claimed, teetered between celebration and frenzy. Yet as Roman rule settled over Gaul, perceptions began to change. By the 1st century CE, the Gauls were no longer simply barbarians, they were subjects of the empire, and many became citizens. Roman authors now spoke of Gallo-Roman nobles, educated in Latin, participating in Senate debates, sponsoring temples and games. Towns like Lugdunum, Nemausus, and Treverorum became centers of culture. A new image emerged, the civilized Gaul, loyal, productive, and Roman in all but origin. Still, a cultural tension lingered. To some Romans, Gauls remained suspect, never fully Roman, too prone to rebellion or rusticity. To others, they were a source of strength, fierce soldiers, skilled artisans, and keepers of old-world wisdom. This duality would persist throughout the empire's life. The Gauls were both insiders and outsiders, both embraced and exoticized. By late antiquity, as Roman power waned, some Gallic voices began to appear in Latin, bishops, poets, and chroniclers writing not from Rome, but from Autun, Arles, or Tours. These were no longer the Gauls of Caesar's time, but Gallo-Romans, heirs to two worlds, rooted in the land, yet fluent in the language of empire. And in time, the Roman gaze turned elsewhere. New barbarians rose, Goths, Vandals, Franks, and the memory of the old Gauls faded into myth. But the words written by Roman hands remained, shaping how future generations would remember the people of the forests and fields, the iron makers and fire dancers, the defiant and the defeated. It is from these texts that we must read, always with care, for in them lie both truth and distortion, both light and shadow. The Roman eye recorded, but also judged. It admired, yet misunderstood. And so, through it, we glimpse not only who the Gauls were, but also how a rising empire saw the world beyond its walls. After the final trumpets of conquest had faded and the Roman legions had settled into the soil of Gaul, a new age began, not of immediate submission, but of slow transformation. The Gauls did not simply vanish beneath the weight of empire. Instead, they entered into a long negotiation of identity, absorbing, adapting, and at times resisting the Roman world. This was not merely a political change, but a cultural metamorphosis. In cities and countryside alike, Roman customs spread, in architecture, in dress, in language. Latin became the official tongue, taught in schools, spoken in courts, and preached in churches. Roman baths, forums, and amphitheaters rose beside, or atop, Gallic oppida. Temples to Jupiter and Mars replaced shrines to Tyrannes and Cernunnos. And yet, the soul of Gaul did not die. It shifted, taking on Roman forms while preserving something older beneath. This process, often called Romanization, was not uniform. In the south, closer to Massalia and the Mediterranean, Roman influence was deep and swift. Cities like Nemausus, Nimes, and Alate, Arles, became showcases of classical grandeur. Villas flourished, Latin names filled civic roles, and Roman festivals marked the calendar. In the north and west, among the Armoricans, Belgae, and Aquitani, the pace was slower. Here, tribal traditions held longer sway. Old gods were worshipped under new names. Inscriptions might call Mercury Arvenorix, blending Roman deity with Gallic title. Rural sanctuaries continued to host rituals, even as official temples bore the emperor's image. Religion became a meeting ground of cultures. The imperial cult, worship of the emperor and Rome, was promoted heavily, especially in civic centers. But the Gallic pantheon was not erased. Instead, it was absorbed, reinterpreted, and even honored in Rome itself. Deities such as Epona, Tyrannes, and Sucellus gained Roman followings. This syncretism allowed Gallic spiritual life to persist, even flourish, under imperial rule. Resistance did not disappear either. There were uprisings, especially in the early years. The revolt of Julius Sacrovir and Julius Florus in 21 CE, both Romanized Gallic nobles, showed that discontent still simmered beneath the surface. Even as these men adopted Roman names and language, their cause was tribal pride and protest against heavy taxation and cultural erasure. But resistance took other forms too: cultural resilience, private customs, oral memory. In rural villages, people still told stories of Brennus and Vercingetorix. Festivals held echoes of the old calendar. Language, though shifting toward Latin, retained Celtic terms and turns of phrase. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, a hybrid identity had formed, Gallo-Roman. These were men and women born into both worlds. They worshipped at Roman altars but remembered tribal ancestors. They sent their sons to Roman schools, but spoke a local Latin laced with Gallic rhythm. Their houses bore mosaics of Roman myth and Celtic beast. Their names, Tiberius Segamaros, Lucia Camulorix, bridged two civilizations. And when Christianity spread across the empire, Gaul again adapted on its own terms. The new faith took root among the Gallo-Romans, but often merged with older beliefs. Saints were honored where gods once stood. Holy wells replaced sacred springs. Bishops took on the civic roles once held by tribal chiefs and Roman governors. This fusion was neither defeat nor triumph, but a testament to the endurance of culture. The Gauls, though politically conquered, remained creators of their own future. They reshaped the tools of empire to reflect their own traditions. They preserved their soul beneath Roman robes. And in this way, the people of Gaul, once defiant tribes, became the forerunners of a new world, not Roman, not Gallic, but something born of both. As the centuries turned and the authority of Rome began to fracture, the land once called Gaul found itself standing at a crossroads, not just of empires, but of faith, culture, and destiny. The old gods had long reigned, Tyrannes with his thunder, Cernunnos among the beasts, Epona the rider of horses. But now a new faith was spreading, born in the east, grown strong in Rome, and carried by missionaries, bishops, and martyrs. It was the faith of the Christians, and in time, it would reshape the very soul of Gaul. Christianity had reached the region early, possibly by the 2nd century CE. Traditions tell of Saint Pothinus and Saint Irenaeus in Lugdunum, Lyon, preaching under threat of death. In 177 CE, a fierce persecution claimed dozens of lives there, including children and elders, whose steadfastness inspired future converts. These early martyrs became saints, their graves holy ground, their names etched into memory. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christianity had grown from secret gatherings in houses to public churches, aided by imperial favor following Constantine's conversion. The church in Gaul organized itself with bishops at the helm, each centered in a major city. Autun, Arles, Tours, and Trier emerged as key ecclesiastical centers, and bishops like Hilary of Poitiers and Martin of Tours became guiding lights, not only in spiritual matters, but in civic life. Bishop Martin, in particular, captured the imagination of the people. A former soldier who embraced poverty and humility, he traveled the countryside performing miracles, healing the sick, and destroying pagan temples, not with hatred, but with sorrow, seeking to convert rather than to crush. His cloak, famously cut in two to share with a beggar, became a relic. His tomb at Tours drew pilgrims from across the West. As the Christian Church gained ground, Gallic identity shifted once more. The Latin language became the voice of liturgy. Pagan festivals were reinterpreted as feasts of saints. The sacred groves of the druids were now monasteries, their solitude turned to contemplation. And yet, the old beliefs did not vanish, they lingered, now cloaked in new names. Churches often stood atop earlier temples. Holy springs once dedicated to healing deities were now blessed by Christian saints. Rural customs, the lighting of fires, the marking of seasons, continued under Christian guise, blending ancient tradition with the new theology. Meanwhile, Roman authority waned. By the late 4th century, the Western Empire faltered under the weight of invasion, economic decline, and internal strife. Gaul was no longer a stable province but a shifting frontier, caught between the remnants of Roman order and the stirrings of new powers. Into this breach came the Germanic tribes, the Franks, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Alemanni, not as destroyers alone, but as settlers, kings, and claimants to legitimacy. They did not seek to erase Gaul, but to inherit and reshape it. The Franks, under the Merovingians, would rise to dominate the north. The Visigoths held sway in the south, while the Burgundians carved out a kingdom of their own in the Rhone Valley. Each adopted elements of Roman and Christian culture, building churches, issuing laws, marrying local elites. And thus, Christian Gaul became the bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, between Rome and the future. The bishops, more than any general, held society together. They preserved literacy, administered justice, and negotiated with invading kings. Monasteries became centers of learning, keeping alive the ancient texts, some Roman, some Gallic, now all Christian. The people themselves, neither fully Roman nor purely Gallic, became something new. They were Gallo-Romans, but also now Christians, subjects of tribal kings, yet bearers of Roman memory. The identity of the Gauls, once tribal and pagan, had passed through fire, of conquest, of conversion, of cultural fusion. What emerged was a land ready to become medieval France, but still echoing with the drums of the past. Though centuries had passed since the last Druid fell silent and the Oppida crumbled into earth, the Gauls were not forgotten. Their story, forged in resistance, myth, and transformation, endured in ways both quiet and grand, shaping the soul of the lands they once called home. For medieval chroniclers, the Gauls were figures of origin and mystery. Often, they appeared cloaked in biblical or classical garb, their true history blended with allegory. They were cast as descendants of Japheth, or as noble savages conquered for the sake of civilization. Their names, Vercingetorix, Brennus, flickered through Latin texts, invoked less for their deeds than for what they symbolized, an untamed past, overcome. Yet in the countryside, the memory was more vivid. Folk tales spoke of giants who once ruled the hills, of kings who slept beneath mountains, waiting for a day of return. The outlines of ancient hill forts were said to be the work of titanic hands. Roman roads, still used, were often called the ways of the Gauls. Old customs persisted: bonfires on hills, seasonal feasts, and rituals around wells and stones, reimagined as Christian, but born in deeper soil. In the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered its classical past, the Gauls were reborn in scholarship. French humanists pored over Caesar's commentaries, not just to learn Latin, but to understand their ancestry. The Gauls, once enemies of Rome, were now recast as heroes of liberty, lovers of freedom and proud of their soil. This idea reached its height in the 19th century, during the rise of nationalism. France, seeking a past that predated the Roman Empire, turned to the Gauls as founding fathers. Vercingetorix, long viewed through a Roman lens, became a patriotic icon. Statues were raised in his honor, most famously at Alesia, commissioned by Napoleon III, depicting the warrior with flowing hair, chainmail, and a defiant gaze. School children were taught that they were numbers ancêtres les Gaulois, our ancestors the Gauls. This was not a precise truth, but a symbolic one. The Gauls came to represent the native spirit of France, bold, earthy, rooted in land and tradition. In art and literature, their image flourished. Painters imagined druids in misty groves, warriors clashing with legions, women standing fearless atop city walls. Writers penned epics and tragedies. Even popular culture joined the chorus, most notably with Asterix les Gaulois, the beloved comic series where clever Gauls outwit Romans with potions and wit, making children laugh while whispering of cultural pride. But beyond nationalism, the memory of the Gauls speaks to something older and deeper. It speaks of a people who lived close to the land, who saw divinity in forests and rivers, who trusted in ancestral wisdom, who valued community, courage, and honor. It reminds us that history is not just a record of victors, but a weaving of many voices, some loud, some nearly lost. And that even those who were conquered can shape the identity of the world that followed. Today, as archaeologists uncover more of their world, their coins, their bones, their altars, and as scholars translate old inscriptions and re-evaluate ancient texts, the Gauls rise once more, not as caricatures, but as humans, complex, resilient, and worthy of remembrance. The Gauls may have vanished as a people, but they survive in memory, in landscape, and in the spirit of those who call their lands home. As we walk back through the centuries, across the fields and rivers that once bore the footprints of the Gauls, a quiet question follows us: what do they leave behind, not in ruins, but in wisdom? What, in the end, do the Gauls teach us? The first answer lies in their resilience. The Gauls endured countless changes, cultural upheavals, war, assimilation, and the passing of empire. Yet in every age, they adapted. They did not surrender to oblivion. Instead, they transformed, first as Gallo-Romans, then as Christians, later as French and European. Theirs is a lesson in survival, not through forgetfulness, but through evolution, a testament to the power of identity that bends without breaking. They teach us the importance of community and kinship. In a world without centralized states or empires of bureaucracy, the Gauls built lives upon trust, honor, and shared memory. Their society, while tribal, was bound by oaths, feasts, and collective belief. Decisions were made not by decree but in councils, where even the voices of the common folk could be heard. In our age of increasing disconnection, their example of communal belonging speaks quietly but clearly. They remind us of the sacredness of nature. The Gauls lived in a world where rivers were goddesses, trees held spirit, and stones bore memory. They did not see the land as something to conquer, but as something to revere. Modern people, so often estranged from earth and sky, might find in the Gauls a lost way of seeing, a reverence for the cyclical, for the mystery of seasons, and for the quiet presence of the non-human world. They also leave us a warning about the cost of division. Caesar could conquer Gaul not because the Romans were invincible, but because the tribes were divided. Rivalries, pride, and short-term gains prevented a lasting unity. Only too late did leaders like Vercingetorix attempt to gather them under one banner. His failure was not of courage, but of timing. The lesson is timeless: a people divided are vulnerable, not just to arms, but to forgetfulness. And yet, the Gauls also teach us about dignity in loss. They were defeated, yes. But they met their fate not in cowardice, but in defiance. At Alesia, they fought with desperation and pride. In the courts of Rome, they walked as equals. In legend, they refused to be erased. There is nobility in such memory, a reminder that greatness is not only in triumph, but in how one faces the inevitable. Finally, they offer a vision of cultural richness. The Gauls created art that still astonishes. They spoke languages now lost but once alive with poetry. Their laws, their myths, their gods, all contributed to the mosaic of human civilization. Though they did not leave vast libraries or marble palaces, they left something perhaps more enduring, a presence, felt in stone circles, in carved torcs, in the names of hills and rivers. To study the Gauls is not merely to remember a vanished people. It is to recognize something in ourselves, a yearning for meaning, a bond to the land, a capacity for courage, and the enduring hope that our stories will be remembered. The echoes of iron, from their forges, their battles, their plows, still hum beneath the soil of Europe. And in that hum, if we listen closely, we may still hear the heartbeat of Gaul. Now, at the edge of this long journey, we look back over the winding paths the Gauls once walked, from the dense forests of Armorica to the windswept ridges of the central highlands, from the sunlit vineyards of Aquitania to the mist-covered rivers of the north. They began not as a single people, but as many tribes, scattered across the land. Proud, diverse, and independent. Yet they shared a common heart, one that beat to the rhythm of the earth, that honored gods in groves and fought not only for land, but for identity. We have seen their world, full of music and fire, of iron and gold. A world where warriors roared on hilltops and children learned stories at the hearth. Where druids whispered truths that outlived the empires. Where art curled like smoke, not in straight lines, but in living spirals. And we have seen their fall, not sudden, but slow. The coming of Rome was not just a clash of armies, but a collision of worlds. The Gauls did not vanish. they became part of the very empire they once resisted. They wore its clothes, spoke its tongue, prayed in its churches. Yet in that transformation, they left a mark. They shaped Roman Gaul, they birthed the Gallo-Roman identity, and in time, they laid the cultural foundation of France itself. Even as Latin replaced their speech, their place names endured. Even as temples crumbled, their myths found new voice. Their legacy is not housed in marble but in memory. It lives in the soil, in the names of rivers, in the festivals that still echo with the laughter of fires past. It lives in the pride of a people who still call Gaul their ancient home. And it lives in us, when we remember. So let us remember not just the battles or the banners, but the quieter truths, the weaving of community, the sacredness of time, the courage to stand, and the wisdom to change. The Gauls are gone. But their spirit, like the mist in the morning, rises still from the land, a gentle breath reminding us that no people are ever truly lost, so long as someone still tells their story. And now, the tale is told. Farewell, sons and daughters of Gaul.